terrifying mental disorders you've never heard of. Cotard syndrome. During the late 1880s, French neurologist Jules Cotard had a very peculiar experience with one of his patients. Her name was Mademoiselle X, and she came to the neurologist claiming that she didn't need to eat anymore. She said this because she believed that she was dead. For some reason, this patient was fully convinced that she had no stomach, no chest, no blood, and no brain. And she knew for a fact that she simply wasn't alive and was not able to die. She told Cotard that she must have been condemned to eternal damnation, and for that reason she cannot possibly die a natural death. As if she could have, she would have died already, as her organs were rotting and she didn't have any blood. And because this patient believed that she had no internal organs, she simply stopped eating as there was no need to, and unsurprisingly, she later died of starvation. This interaction that Jules Cotard had experienced with this patient definitely left an imprint on him and forced him to document everything that this patient was saying and every symptom that they were having. Through this study, he coined the term Cotard syndrome and described the condition as the delusion of negation, stating that it was a psychiatric syndrome that varied in severity. He claimed that mild cases were characterized by despair and self-loathing, while severe cases were characterized by intense delusions of negation and chronic psychiatric depression. Now, although this sounds like an odd one-off story that happened almost 200 years ago, that's not at all the case, and this syndrome still exists today. And while it is extremely rare, there are still people suffering from this syndrome around the world. Cotard syndrome is also known as the walking corpse syndrome. The main symptom of having Cotard syndrome is having a strong belief that you are dead. Many people with this condition simply believe that their internal organs are rotting, or that those organs are missing altogether and they are just existing but not alive. A statistical analysis of people suffering from this study showed that 55% of patients with Cotard syndrome believed that they were immortal due to this condition, while the other 45% denied their own existence, claiming that they did not exist, which is definitely a hard sell when you're the one explaining you don't exist. Cotard syndrome is relatively simple to understand, but I'm sure for its patients it's an extremely terrifying experience. Just imagine being fully convinced that you're either missing organs or having organs that are rotting away, or just simply believing that you are somehow dead. It's almost mind-bending trying to even comprehend the mindset in the first place. So I couldn't even imagine how confusing it is to be experiencing that as a reality. Most of the people experiencing these delusions typically end up neglecting their personal care, refusing to eat, clean themselves, sleep, use the washroom, and also may experience self-harming behaviors, all because that they believe there is no reason to maintain a body that they literally consider to be lifeless. To this day, very little is known about this syndrome, but it is still associated with severe depression, schizophrenia, and other neurological issues such as brain lesions. Cotard syndrome is a very peculiar mental condition, but for this list, it's only the tip of the iceberg, and we're just getting into some of the most terrifying and rare mental conditions. Coro. I want you to be honest. Have you ever looked down and thought, dang, my little bro must be shrinking. It was never this small. Well, in that case, you might be suffering from Coro. Honestly, I don't even know where to begin with it. It's also known as genital retraction syndrome or shrinking penis disease, both of which definitely give an odd foundation, and both of which are actually not even fully accurate. And while Coro is a syndrome that does occur worldwide, it is considered a cultural bound delusion, essentially meaning that the symptoms of this delusion are only recognized in specific societies and cultures. Patients suffering with Coro experience overwhelming and intense beliefs that their sexual organs are retracting, and while this literally isn't happening, these people suffering from this disease will go to extreme lengths to prevent this shrinkage from happening. Most people suffering from this condition typically begin by reporting anxiety attacks due to their perceived lack of genitalia, and this perceived shrinkage will be a huge cause of stress for the individual suffering from Coro. And if you're a woman, don't think you're safe from Coro, because there are women who experience Coro, but obviously they aren't experiencing their penis shrinking. They believe that their nipples are retracting and that their breasts are also retracting into their bodies, slowly shrinking. There are cases in which patients experiencing Coro symptoms will have these symptoms for years, and at that point it will be considered chronic. And to doctors, that is an indication of a potential comorbidity with body dysmorphic disorder, also known as BDD. Interestingly, a lot of people experiencing Coro also experience an intense anxiety or fear of impending death, essentially meaning that these people believe that their genitals will shrink so small that they are literally going to die. And this specific belief has a strong cultural link to traditional Chinese beliefs. This sounds kind of silly and obviously odd, but the delusions that these patients are experiencing are nothing funny and truly terrifying. This delusion can cause extreme anxiety, panic, compulsive behaviors, and even habits such as genital stretching to prevent this perceived shrinkage or retraction. The cause for this delusion isn't fully clear, but it is believed to be primarily fueled by cultural beliefs and stress. Now, like I mentioned, if you are experiencing Koro, you aren't actually experiencing any sort of shrinkage of any of your body parts, but what's interesting is that there is a bit of a devious feedback loop that you are getting. Typically, when people are experiencing a Koro attack, they will experience vasoconstriction, which will actually cause their genitals to temporarily shrink a little bit. This actually affirms their delusion and causes a very vicious cycle until the delusion is so strong that it is simply a core belief. And while this vasoconstriction is only temporary, when you are believing such a odd delusion, you are not necessarily thinking logically about this. And even when presented with the fact, it is still hard to come to the conclusion that you are not shrinking. Depending on what culture you're a part of when you are experiencing this Koro, the treatments may differ. In traditional Chinese medicine, typically the remedy that is recommended is a herbal tincture that is applied to your genitals. While in some African cultures, people experiencing Koro will be prescribed a weight to attach to their genitals to help stretch it, to of course maintain its size. Neither of these remedies sound particularly pleasant, and this entire affliction, while silly seeming, is definitely rare. It is a bit unfortunate that your body is almost unwillingly feeding into your delusion by shrinking your junk during these times of panic, unintentionally feeding your delusion more and more. However, typically instances of Koro are not lifelong. Although we may be able to get a chuckle out of it, it's definitely something I would never want to experience. So yeah, Koro literally has men believing that their penis is shrinking and it's gonna get so small that they are literally going to die. And it's still only the second entry on this list. Let's keep going. Body integrity identity disorder. Body integrity identity disorder, also known as BIID, is a condition that I felt made a lot of sense to put here because it kind of relates to the last one, although it's not fully the same. People who are experiencing Koro disorder believe that one of their appendages is shrinking and they are trying to maintain it, whereas people with BIID experience essentially a disassociation from one of their limbs. What this means is that people experiencing this condition essentially don't want either part or one or multiple of their limbs because to them it just doesn't feel like it's theirs. To try to understand how these people are feeling, people with BIID have described it as imagining that you are growing a new limb. That would feel unnatural and you obviously wouldn't want that there. That's how people with BIID feel about their natural born limbs. And people experiencing this condition typically go to extreme lengths to essentially feel normal, typically by seeking amputation for the perfectly healthy limb. Some patients with severe cases of this disorder even wish and desire to become paraplegic. This condition is extremely rare and also uncommonly studied, meaning that there is not much known about it, besides the fact that it blurs the lines between psychiatry and neurology. And for most people suffering from BIID, treatment specifically focuses on understanding the underlying cause for this deep desire. And like I mentioned, for some, does result in amputation. Imagine how you would feel if you felt like there was a part of your body that simply was alien to you, and with nobody to relate to or to be able to give you any sort of answers, it must be a lonely and heartbreaking experience. One thing that came to mind when researching this specific disorder was that one episode of Dr. Phil when that lady poured, I believe it was like drain cleaner in her eyes to make herself permanently blind because she just wanted to be blind. I'm not sure if she was suffering specifically from BIID, but it definitely seems like she was suffering similar symptoms and obviously didn't feel like she was supposed to have the ability to see. But speaking of these limbs feeling alien, let's discuss the next mental disorder. Alien hand syndrome. Alien hand syndrome varies pretty drastically from BIID in one major way. People experiencing alien hand syndrome don't feel like their hand isn't supposed to be part of their body. Their hand simply doesn't act in accordance to their will, almost as if their hand was a sentient being or acting on its own will or potentially an alien limb to your body. Patients experiencing alien hand syndrome typically experience symptoms in their left hand, and what this hand does typically varies depending on the severity of the situation. In 1908, when alien hand syndrome was first discovered, a 57-year-old woman was actually attacked by her alien hand, with this hand consistently smacking and trying to choke the woman, and she had to fight for her life to prevent her rogue limb from killing her. And while this example is extreme and obviously terrifying, It's not the norm, although it isn't uncommon for this rogue limb to do things that you likely wouldn't want them to. Like undressing yourself in public, or simply spilling food or drink, or simply dropping things for no apparent reason. Interestingly, while the first case was reported in 1908, the number of cases actually increased in the 1940s onward when a specific surgery for epilepsy began to become more popular. The specific epilepsy surgery that was correlated with alien hand syndrome was a surgery that essentially disconnected both sides of the brain, cutting the corpus callosum down the center of the brain. The corpus callosum is essentially a bridge of nerves that connects the left brain to the right brain. And disconnecting them, although effective for epilepsy, had consequences. And while that specific epilepsy treatment isn't the only cause for alien hand syndrome, it was definitely one of the most prominent initially. However, with more recent research, it has been discovered that people with medial frontal cortex or parietal lobe damage can also suffer from an alien hand. Although, depending on the area of your brain that was damaged, you will get a different type of alien hand syndrome, which is interesting and also pretty scary. Which I suppose makes sense, but definitely doesn't make it any less scary. People who had their medial frontal cortex damaged typically experience their alien hand being mischievous, with the most common symptoms being impulsive groping and the reluctance to let go of anything. With damage to your corpus callosum, typically you experience your hands literally fighting each other, which I can only imagine is a very unpleasant and scary experience. Now, somewhat differently, people with damage to their parietal lobe experience this condition a bit differently, as they not only don't have control over this arm and have it kind of do whatever it wants, they also feel estranged from this limb. Similar, but not to the same extent that people with BIID experience. But just imagine that. Not only do you feel like this limb that is on your natural body doesn't belong to you, but also not even being able to control it. It simply is there, part of you, but it kind of has a mind of its own. That is undeniably terrifying. Currently, the direct cause for why this happens in the brain is unknown, and unfortunately, there isn't a cure either. One of the most popular treatments is pretty simple and basically just involves making your alien hand hold on to an object consistently to give it something to do, essentially. I think being born with this condition, you could likely learn to adapt to it relatively quickly and it could be part of normal life, but I think one of the most terrifying parts about this disease is that it's typically developed later in life, meaning that you can live a totally normal life having control of both of your arms. And by getting brain damage in one way or another, not only can you lose control of one of your limbs, but you can literally lose control of one of your limbs. Like, this limb isn't just paralyzed. It is doing things without your consent. It has a mind of its own. And depending on the severity of what this hand is doing, you may have a violent appendage attached to your body with its sights aimed at you. Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Alice in Wonderland syndrome is a neurological disorder that distorts your perception. Typically, this distortion is experienced visually, and these visual distortions are perceived by objects either appearing larger than they are, or smaller than they are, or closer than they are, or potentially even farther than they are. And as you may be able to assume, this is extremely debilitating. These are only a few of the over 60 symptoms associated with Alice in Wonderland syndrome. The Alice in Wonderland books and movies are interesting and fun and whimsical, but when that sort of psychedelic experience is your consistent reality, it becomes a lot less appealing. And for patients suffering with this condition, they can experience not only visual, but also auditory, touch, and time perception issues. It's important to note that these aren't necessarily hallucinations. They're simply a misinterpretation of real things that are happening for a reason that is not fully understood. All that is known about Alice in Wonderland syndrome is that it's currently associated with migraines, head trauma, and EBV, Epstein-Barr virus. In most cases, patients don't experience symptoms consistently, but rather in series of attacks where suddenly almost everything in their reality changes. Just imagine you're sitting on the couch watching TV when all of a sudden the TV that you're looking at becomes 5 times bigger and the room that you're in becomes 10 times smaller, and all of a sudden all you hear is ringing and people talking, and it feels like time's moving really slow and then really fast, and everything's consistently changing and you have almost no ground, no basis of reality, and you can't trust what you're seeing, hearing, smelling, or touching, and all you can simply do is wait it out. But this wait itself can seem endless with the perception of time being so distorted. However, as disorienting and terrifying as this experience may sound, this disease is pretty understudied and currently isn't considered a neurological disorder or a psychiatric illness, and is kind of just in this medical gray area. And currently, there isn't even a known number of how many people are experiencing this mental condition to begin with. A reason for why it's low priority to be researched is because it's not considered to be dangerous, which I suppose is a nice benefit. However, 15% of people that do experience this condition have their attack almost instantly followed up with a migraine, which definitely adds insult to injury. And in that case, there is at least pain associated with this disorienting experience. This condition has been seen in both adults and children, but is most commonly seen in children. And while its cause is unknown, during studies of people who have been actively having these attacks, there is abnormal amounts of electrical activity taking place inside the patient's brain, resulting in an abnormal amount of blood flow to certain parts of the brain that process visual perception and texture. Regardless, even with the lack of classification and little known information about this disease, to me, the experience of Alice in Wonderland syndrome does sound terrifying and extremely unfortunate for those who suffer essentially in silence with almost no answers. It almost sounds like a random bad trip that you don't consent to and can happen at almost any time. Something I wouldn't wish on anybody. But we do still have one more entry to discuss. And quickly, before we get to this final entry on the list, I did want to mention, there was at least another 10 or 15 entries that I researched and wanted to put in this video that I simply had to cut for time, because we post videos every Friday. So with that, if you guys liked this video about rare and terrifying mental disorders, please let me know if you guys would like a part 2. I've got plenty more to talk about, and I'd also love to hear if you guys have any recommendations in the comments below. That being said, let's get to the final entry on this list. Capgras delusion. There's no doubt that every entry on this list in one way or another has been upsetting, disheartening, terrifying, and of course, obscure. But I saved this entry for last because I believe it to be one of likely the most upsetting and depressing entries on this list. But the belief that patients suffering from this delusion believe is extremely disheartening. Those suffering from Capgras delusion believe that someone close to them, typically a loved one, has been replaced by an identical imposter. And in some cases, they even believe that this imposter is going to do them harm. Unsurprisingly, Capgras delusions are typically associated with people experiencing paranoid schizophrenia, but these delusions are also present in people with dementia, brain tumors, and brain injuries. How this works is when you see another human's face, your eyes send a signal to the occipital cortex in your brain, and from there, that signal is sent to the fusiform part of the brain. This part of the brain is specifically responsible for facial recognition, which allows you to not only recognize people, but also tell people apart. The fusiform part of the brain then sends a signal to the amygdala, and based on the signal that the amygdala gets, it will release specific chemicals depending on how you perceive this person. These chemicals are essentially the precursor to emotions and help your brain understand how you love and how you care about someone and who you love and who you care about. Now, for people with Capgras delusion, their brain varies because the fusiform part of their brain is not sending a strong enough signal to the amygdala, essentially meaning you can recognize somebody's face, but you're not getting the chemical reaction allowing you to essentially feel the emotions you're supposed to feel when seeing and thinking about that person. That lack of chemical release makes this person seem foreign or alien or like something is missing, which is where the delusion comes into play, that this person must not be the real person that I know and love. This must be an imposter. This must be a clone. This must be a fake. And that is essentially how we understand how this delusion comes to be. And while we may understand how it happens, it doesn't make it any less terrifying or upsetting. If any of you watching this have experienced a family member with Alzheimer's, then you kind of know what I'm talking about. How upsetting and how scary it is to see somebody that you've known all of your life simply not remember you anymore, or to even not like you anymore. Growing up, one of my grandmothers actually had Alzheimer's, and during the later stages of it, she not only forgot who my sister was, who was living with her at the time, she also began to resent my sister for seemingly no reason. I can't imagine how that would feel to have not only your grandmother forget you, but begin to hate you and openly cuss you out and disrespect you. Of course, you have to understand that that's not them, that that's the disease, but it still hurts, and it's disheartening to see the deterioration of a loved one. Obviously, Alzheimer's and schizophrenia as well are terrifying and upsetting diseases, but this video is specifically focused on unheard of and obscure diseases, which is why I didn't outright mention them. Focusing back on Capgras delusion, not only do people suffering from this believe that someone that they love or know may be replaced by some sort of clone, but depending on the severity of their condition, what they do about this belief could range drastically. For example, the person experiencing this delusion may refuse to talk to that person altogether, as they do not believe that that's actually their loved one. In other cases, the person experiencing these delusions may actually physically assault or attack these people as they believe that they have done something negative with their loved one and replace them, and they want to find answers. And in most cases, people refuse to believe give any evidence to prove that they are not an imposter. And some people even become obsessed with exposing this imposter, going to almost any lengths to expose the true reality, which is obviously just a delusion. It's for this reason that I wanted to save this condition for the end of the list, because I believe on this list it's definitely the most terrifying and upsetting. And as of right now, there is little known, no cure, and not even treatment available for this delusion. Mental health is no joke, and in this video we discussed some truly terrifying and obscure mental health conditions. And I hope that more research will be conducted to help treat people with these conditions. The scariest cults from around the world. Imagine you're standing on the street just minding your own business when you get approached by a couple and they have some important information for you. They tell you that they are spiritual guides and they can help take you to a next level of existence beyond Earth and human comprehension. They say that you can transcend humanity by transforming into an immortal extraterrestrial being. It sounds like an interesting proposal. So you take a flyer and attend a meeting, and at this point you can go either one of two ways. Your suspicions are either confirmed and you realize that you spoke to crazy people, or you believed you talked to some of the most important people ever, and in that instance, you just joined a cult. This cult is known as Heaven's Gate, and it was an American cult founded in 1974 by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who, like I mentioned, saw themselves as spiritual guides to a next level of human existence. Without spoiling the ending, Heaven's Gate is most commonly known for its mass suicides committed by its members, but the story goes a lot deeper than just the headlines. Nettles and Applewhite first met in 1972 and went on a journey of spiritual discovery together, and came out on the other side identifying themselves as two witnesses of Revelation, or the Book of Apocalypse in the Bible. This claim alone, and some clever convincing, was reason enough for them to start attracting hundreds of people to start at least paying attention to their movement in the mid-70s. And after a few years, they even had over a dozen members adopting a monastic lifestyle, dedicating their life to Heaven's Gate, and giving up all worldly pursuits beyond this cult, which is insane. This cult is commonly recognized as a UFO religion, primarily because the central belief of this group was that the followers could transform themselves into immortal extraterrestrial beings by rejecting their human nature. By rejecting this human nature, they would, by default, ascend to heaven, or what they would refer to as the next level. This cult primarily grew by Applewhite and Nettles trying to contact other extraterrestrials, aka like-minded people, aka other crazy people. They took out ads and flyers to promote meetings where they would recruit disciples that they called the crew. At these events, they would purport to represent beings from another planet who were looking for patients for an experiment. That alone is already creepy. They got straight to the crazy even on sign up. There was no easing into it, it seemed. They mentioned, though, that those who agreed to take part in their experiment would be brought to a higher evolutionary level. An interesting proposal, potentially, but still, red flags are everywhere. In 1975, Applewhite and Nettles preached at a motel hall in Oregon, and following that session, over 20 people sold all of their worldly possessions and essentially disappeared off the face of the planet, not being seen by family, friends, or even the general public at all. These people didn't just disappear, but they had become a part of Heaven's Gate, which at this point had already began going underground. Applewhite and Nettles changed their name to Doe and T, and they had led nearly 100 people across the country to ditch their families and join Heaven's Gate. The lore that they came up with is deep, and it's a really weird twist on a lot of existing religious texts and theories about history. But one of the more interesting claims they made is that they believe that Jesus himself was an alien, which is an interesting take for sure. But what's more interesting is what happened in October of 1996. The group rented a large house that they called the Monastery, which was a 10,000 square foot mansion in California. At the time, they were paying $7,000 per month in rent cash, and they even took out alien abduction insurance on each of their members, with a $1 million payout per person. Which, who the hell is selling alien abduction insurance? But that's a side point. That's a video about insurance scams, not cults. Now, this house isn't the interesting event, but it's the precursor to what really put this cult on the map. Nearly 1 year into renting the monastery, Applewhite taped a video of himself entitled Doe's Final Exit, where he spoke on mass death and how it was the only way to evacuate this earth. He was convinced that the comet Hale-Bopp was the sign that the group had been looking for, and speculated that there was a UFO following this comet. And because of this, Applewhite and 38 of his followers prepared a ritual death. This death lined up exactly with when the comet was closest to the earth, so that their souls could reach the next level. In the following days, 39 people had taken a concoction of vodka and poison, and, like you may have guessed, died. There is so much crazy and honestly disturbing lore to this cult, but I think the best way to describe it is that they believe that humans were boring, aliens were cool, and if a human wanted to become an alien, they had to die. It's amazing what people are willing to believe and dedicate and sacrifice their life for. Oh, and if the Heaven's Gate logo looks familiar, Lil Uzi Vert used it as inspiration for his album cover, which is odd. Assuming you're a semi-reasonable person, you're likely not interested or swayed by the claims of an afterlife and UFOs and being a part of the Bible from random strangers. What a reasonable person may be interested in, though, is a community that worships God, people that are like-minded in faith, a faith that at surface level seems semi-reasonable. In this instance, you may be interested in the Children of God. This name already may sound familiar, and that's because Nick Crowley, a great YouTuber, just made a video about some of the lore involved with this cult. Specifically, the TV programs this cult was producing, which was insane. It was essentially propaganda pieces for children. And spoiler alert, it was pretty disturbing. But we'll get to that. The Children of God lore is deep, and I'll do my best to summarize it as neatly as possible. The Children of God was founded by a creep named David Berg in 1968. It initially attracted young followers with the message of love, communal living, and devotion, which may sound innocent enough. But the group soon became infamous for its controversial beliefs and practices. Most of these controversial beliefs and practices started to be introduced once the cult was more established. Initially, some of their beliefs were more conservative and aligned with the Bible, although it seemed that the group's beliefs started to morph to fit Berg's personal desires, which we'll get into. For example, initially the group was rather conservative and didn't even believe in hand-holding until marriage. But once Berg had an affair with his assistant, he then started spreading messages of polygamy, which turned into what he called sharing, which we'll get into, and that gets a lot darker. Before we get too into the weeds, let's give some context. This group was founded with a core focus on an apocalyptic prophecy, where Berg was claiming that the world was set to end in 1993. And the purpose of this group was to promote love and devotion to God so that they could be saved during this apocalypse. They spread their messages through song and dedicated as much time as possible to praising God before the end times. Child members of this group were not even educated because they saw it as a waste of time because the world was ending soon anyway. So all of the children and adults in this group were simply sitting, hanging out, singing songs, waiting for the end of the world, which to me doesn't sound like a great time. But that's just me. Floor Edwards, a previous member of the Children of God, said this about the cult's mindset at the time. Quote, "For many it was euphoric thinking about the afterlife. We earned that spot in heaven. We were the chosen ones." That's definitely a take on it. Interestingly, Berg wasn't seen very often by most of the cult members, as at its peak, the group had over 10,000 members worldwide. Although he was in consistent communication with all of his followers through what he called Mo letters, which was essentially daily propaganda pieces, where he would take Bible verses and intertwine them with his own twisted doctrine, which, like I mentioned earlier, evolved over time. These Mo letters included instructions that his followers must follow, and strangely enough, a lot of the imagery in these letters was rather graphic. We'll say that. According to ex-members of the Children of God, Mo wrote over 3,000 of these Mo letters, which is insane. But these letters weren't the only way that the Children of God was able to get their message out. Like I mentioned, Nick Crowley made a great video about the TV series that the Children of God had created and that was televised called Life with Grandpa, in which he describes the TV show essentially indoctrinating children into the values of the group and the religious beliefs that were unsavory, to say the least. To really paint the picture, there's a scene in the show where a woman is shown as a robot with literal boobs, and Grandpa, aka David Berg, was talking about how much he loves this perfect woman. And there's many episodes with young girls singing about how their purpose is to cook, clean, and take care of the men in their life. That is honestly just a tame sampling of some of the cool stuff in this cult's kid show. Of course, I'm using cool ironically. Now, going back to the concept of sharing. Without getting too graphic, essentially, Berg was promoting love with no bounds, as he claimed that Jesus created love and sex for people to enjoy, and he thought the best way to honor God was to have it without limits, which to him meant with anybody at any time, consenting or not, which also included with children, which is obviously disgusting. Former members who were children at the time said that they felt pressured to do anything with anyone because they knew if they said no that they would be punished by God and potentially not accepted into heaven when the apocalypse came, which was, in their mind, soon. This, unsurprisingly, led to widespread allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, of course, including minors. The Children of God faced significant backlash and legal scrutiny due to the reports of emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse among members, although that wasn't quite enough to take it down fully. That was the bump in the road for the group. After David Berg died, his assistant, who he was having the affairs with, took over the group and tried rebranding the group multiple times in an attempt to distance it from its dark past. And they even tried to renounce some of their harmful practices. However, the decades of trauma experienced by former members was an inseparable part of the cult's history. And with the death of David, the rebrands, and all of the allegations, the group went from over 10,000 members worldwide to today being a small underground internet community. And I personally hope it continues to shrink to the point of nothingness very soon. I'm sure the world not ending in 1993 also had a big part to do with it. Interestingly, multiple celebrities were actually involved with this cult, notably Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan. Rose McGowan described her experience as extremely stressful, like she was walking a high-wire act. She was expected to be perfect physically, and was even cut with a knife by another member when she had a blemish on her finger. How Rose was involved in this group was because her father was actually the leader of the Italian branch of the Children of God. But fortunately, once the Children of God started promoting child abuse, her dad separated from the group entirely. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings in the 1970s were also involved in the group, and even traveled through Central and South America with the group, but didn't remain members for long, as initially they thought it was a dedicated religious group, but found out that it was much deeper than that and cut ties. It's upsetting enough when individuals are tricked into joining cults and doing unspeakable things and having horrible lives, but it's just downright disheartening and depressing when they get their children involved too. Likely unsurprisingly, the Children of God had a extremely high suicide rate, with many ex-members having lifelong trauma, psychological illnesses, and at the very least, horrible, unforgettable memories. But if you're not interested in aliens, and you're not interested in any sort of religious movement, what if a man approached you and told you that he could tell you when you're going to die? This, to anybody, may seem like an interesting proposal, but the more info you start to get, the more the cracks start to show. This man referred to himself as Lou Castor and claimed that he was 1,000 years old and he was the combination of 3 different angels. He claimed that he had died and came back to life and that now he himself can predict deaths accurately, among other things. Potentially one of the biggest draws for some is that Lou claimed that if you were close to him, he could not only predict your death, but bring you back to life, which for most people sounds like a good reason to stick around. But on top of the claims of being resurrected, from a surface level, it looked like the members of this group lived a relatively lavish lifestyle. Lou had a compound in Wichita, Kansas, where he had 10 members of the group living with him. Everybody who was completely provided for with food, shelter, technology, toys, gadgets, ATVs, luxury vehicles, anything these members could want, they had, and it was all provided for by Lou. But interestingly enough, nobody knew what Lou did for work. He said he had stocks and bonds and a cattle ranch down in Texas, but nobody could directly pinpoint his wealth, and it didn't seem like anybody was extremely concerned because they were directly benefiting from it, although it definitely came with a price. Having a 10-person commune with luxury vehicles in Wichita, Kansas, definitely drew attention. But for this cult, that wasn't an issue. And Lou was an active participant in the community. He would donate to the police, have community-wide barbecues in his backyard, and even had an ATV track on his 10-acre property where anybody could come and enjoy the track. This sense of community definitely allowed people to feel a little bit more comfortable, and I think people assumed that if he had something to hide, he wouldn't be so flashy, which may seem reasonable, but you could also say this is more or less of a John Wayne Gacy approach. But here's the thing. Behind closed doors, unspeakable things were happening, and although on the surface it seemed like an outgoing, luxury lifestyle of cool people just having fun, it was really anything but that once you got to the core of the group. When Angel's Landing went from Texas to Wichita, Kansas, they actually gained 3 new members: Lou's real estate agent and 2 young daughters. This real estate agent sold Lou the property, and upon meeting him, she felt very compelled to not only be close to him, but protect him. And he shortly after confessed to her that he was an angel. Because of this information, this real estate agent uprooted herself and her 2 young daughters from Missouri to Wichita, Kansas to join the commune, leaving her husband and her children's father behind. I'm assuming you can guess where this is going, and it ended up with Lou assaulting and abusing both of these young girls. But not only that, combining it with mental manipulation to make them feel like it was almost normal, which it obviously wasn't at all. In 2003, the story got a lot more publicized, as one of the members living in the commune had passed away. This member had seemingly fallen, hit their head, and then fell into the pool, which caused them to drown and die, which obviously got a lot of attention but wasn't necessarily considered suspicious, at least not legally. The death aligned with most accidental drowning deaths and was not considered for having any foul play, although that didn't mean that there wasn't any questions stirring about this commune within the community. At this time, unbeknownst to Lou and the rest of the commune, the police were actually closely monitoring the commune, but not for the reasons you may have thought. They were being monitored by the narcotics department because Lou had unexplained wealth. and their assumption was that there was an illegal drug operation or something along those lines funding this 10-acre ranch with seemingly unlimited money. And with the news breaking of this death on the property, some members in the community had their own questions as well. This member that they lost was considered to be the mother of the group, and she was Lou's right-hand woman. And it was a tragic loss within the group and outside of the group, as she was somebody that people looked up to and at least had a positive relationship with publicly. Following the death of the member who passed away in the pool, the other members of the group were waiting for Lou to bring her back, as he claimed that this was an ability of his. And after some time passed, Lou changed his story and claimed that he doesn't want to bring Patricia back. Lou claimed that where Patricia is now is much better than where we are, and that our goal is to meet her where she's at and not to bring her back here. And I suppose that was a satisfactory response to some of the members. And although the death was ruled as accidental, the FBI was interested, to say the least. They began looking into a Lou Castro and realized that there is no record of this person existing. No documents, no birth certificate, no driver's license. They were dealing with a ghost, until they found one piece of information referencing the name. This was an obituary for a woman he used to live with in a previous smaller commune. This woman had passed away with her new boyfriend and daughter during a leisure flight, and unfortunately, shortly after takeoff, this entire group passed away. It's an interesting side note, but Lou was previously a plane mechanic. That, again, was ruled as an accidental death. But the coincidences are starting to kind of fall apart here. 3 years after the death of the woman in the pool, her husband, another member of Angel's Landing, was killed as well. He was working on his car and laying underneath a vehicle when his jack failed, crushing and killing him. The unfortunate and tragic death of this second member of Angel's Landing was a pivotal moment in discovering the truth. Like I mentioned, the Angel's Landing group was already under investigation secretly by the FBI and local authorities. But once 2 accidental deaths took place within 3 years, they cranked up their search and began looking at alternative means of information. And one thing they found that cracked this case wide open was the insurance payouts on these group members. Both Patricia, the woman who died in the pool, and her husband, who died under the car years later, had large life insurance policies, both of which specifically paying out to the Angel's Landing group, which was 100% controlled by Lou Castro. Each of these policies paid out over $1.2 million. And suddenly, things are starting to make a lot of sense. Somebody who's able to predict deaths and then have them magically happen, somebody who has accidental deaths magically follow him around, and somebody who has an unexplainable amount of wealth, but no source of income. All now starts to make a lot more sense when you realize that there may be some foul play going on here. But in case that's not enough to make you convinced that there was something really strange going on in this cult, 2 years after the husband of the initial woman who died passed away, there was a third death within the group. It was the death of the real estate agent who moved into the commune to protect him. This same woman that had 2 young daughters in the group. Lou got her 2 young daughters together and told them that it was her mother's time and that she was going to die shortly. Obviously, they were extremely upset and didn't want to believe it, and they told their mom. And their mom didn't seem too fazed and reassured them that she wasn't going anywhere and that she was going to be fine. But unfortunately, 2 days later, she passed away in a horrible car accident. And at that point, detectives were no longer allowing this to go on anymore. Once again, a life insurance payout was due to hit Lou's account any day. And coincidentally, the previous balance was getting pretty low from the last payout. It's almost like this was how he was funding his lifestyle. At this point, detectives were just going to his property and had a unique plan to collect fingerprints to try to get more information. They knocked on Lou's door and they told him that they were looking for information on local criminals and had pictures of criminals that they wanted him to potentially identify. The detectives entered his home and were starting to show him pictures, hoping to get fingerprints on the photographs, but they noticed that Lou was only grabbing these photos with his fingernails, meaning that he knew what was going on and that they were not going to get any fingerprints. Eventually, they were able to get him on charges of bank fraud, but realized that they needed to get him on these murders if they wanted him to serve any substantial time. And at this point, the stars almost aligned, because the eldest of the 2 young girls who were a part of this group at this point was an adult, and had met a man who shortly became her boyfriend. Not long into dating, they had a moment and she opened up to him about everything. And that night when she went to bed, he went to the FBI website and informed them about everything that was going on in this strange cult in Wichita. Surprisingly, they were quick to respond, collected her statement, and began a full-blown investigation on all of these claims. At this point, they were able to speak to the younger daughter as well, where they were able to collect all the information they needed to put this man away for a serious amount of time. During this Lou person's trial, it was revealed that his name isn't Lou at all, and that was only one of his many aliases, and that his name is Daniel Perez, and he has an extensive history of sexual abuse and much more. And the result of this trial happened in 2015, when Daniel Perez, aka Lou Castro, was sentenced with 80 years in prison. Unfortunately, all of the deaths involving Angel's Landing were still ruled accidental, but they did have a strong enough case through all of the other crimes to put him away for the rest of his life. Okay, I know this is a cult video and not a true crime video, but for Angel's Landing specifically, the beliefs were rather simple. And it wasn't even super religious, honestly. This mysterious, wealthy man just claimed that he was an angel and could predict deaths and save people near him if they did die. And he also required intimacy with children to maintain his powers. Although, in reality, he was just a pedophile who was killing his own cult members for insurance payouts to fund his lifestyle. So the religious beliefs are simple, but the lore of the actual story is insane. And I thought you guys would appreciate this twisted story. I know we focused on a lot of mind-bending, twisted, pseudo-religious, disgusting beliefs, so I wanted to kind of focus on the reality of the life in these cults in this story. But the more research I did, the more invested I got in this story. And well, here we go. Before we get into the last cult of this video, I just want to say that it is the unfortunate reality that there is so many crazy and scary cults that have existed and still exist to this day. And although I hand-selected a few for this first video, I do have a sizable number of other cults I do want to discuss, although I didn't want to make this video extremely long in case it wasn't something you guys were interested in, because I haven't really discussed cults on the channel before. So if you guys are interested about more scary and truly disturbing cults, let me know in the comments or leave this video a like. This sort of engagement helps me understand what videos you guys actually want to see. But with that, let's get into our final cult, of this video at least. Let's say that you have absolutely no interest in any sort of religious group at all. Let's just say that you're interested in history, and let's say that maybe you found a particular interest with the Knights Templar, the Catholic military group tasked with protecting the Holy Grail. Perhaps that's an area of interest for you. Well, what if you were approached by some individuals who claimed to be the descendants of that military group and claimed to hold their ideals and then some? You may be interested in hearing them out. And what if these people claimed to you that not only were they the descendants of the Knights Templar, but one of the members was also the reincarnation of Moses from the Bible and King Tut's dad? At that point, you're likely gone, but let's say you're still a little interested. But here's the catch. Even if you're potentially interested in hearing them out, you have to be approved. Specifically through a sizable donation, as this cult is a pretty elitist group, with a group size at its peak of only around 300 to 400 members. So unless you were really wealthy, you weren't even able to hear them out, because they believed that only the richest were even worthy of hearing their message. This was the message of the Order of the Solar Temple, a Neo-Templar movement and a cult. This group had members in Canada, Switzerland, and France. One of the founders of this cult actually had a child with another cult member and believed that this child was a perfect child and that it was a higher being, and that any children that were to happen within the cult would be higher beings as well too, to help his daughter on her purpose. The cult grew and grew, and over time there was a lot of mismanagement happening between the two founders who didn't speak much about the direction of the cult. One leader was focusing on the inner workings of the cult, specifically the meditations, ceremonies, and day-to-day management, and the other leader was focused on the recruitment process, essentially running seminars and spreading the message of their special little group. Because this cult required very significant financial backing, members started to become uneasy on where their money was going, as the cult seemed to have not been growing as much as it once was. And this perfect higher level baby was now a teenager, and she was starting to rebel against her own father as well. And in 1991, one of the ex-members actually sued the group, which definitely started to show the writing on the wall for this elitist cult. And the next year, in 1992, one of the cult leaders was actually arrested for trying to buy illegal firearms in Canada, which is some unfortunate foreshadowing for what's about to happen. Later that year, people were becoming more and more restless, as not only were they unsure about where their money was going, but at this point there were so many unfulfilled spiritual promises that people were starting to not believe any of the claims of these cult leaders. This is where things get dark. As the cult was beginning to crumble and they were losing members and backing, they felt that they needed to figure out something quick, and they decided that they needed to have a transition within their movement. This was a transition to another world. At this point, they began to prepare themselves and certain high-ranking people within the Solar Temple that they believed would be highly favored in this new world, aka people that they probably thought they could manipulate. While they were prepping their members about how to transition into this new world, they were also planning how they would get revenge for those who they felt betrayed them, aka people who saw through the lies and left. The spree of this cult's revenge, starting with highly ranking cult members, showing up at the door of previous cult members and stabbing their 5-month-old baby in the heart, as the leader of the Solar Temple claimed that this baby was the Antichrist, when in reality, the parents of this baby, who were also murdered in this horrific event, were simply people who didn't listen to the Solar Temple's demands, which were that they didn't get married and didn't have this baby because it wasn't what the higher beings wanted. It was essentially a power struggle that these former members were no longer interested in playing into. After this horrific murder, there was other instances of strange murder suicides until one of the most insane events associated with this cult happened. On the 5th of October in 1994, 23 people were found dead in a burning chalet in Switzerland. Their bodies were arranged in a circle, and they were all wearing ceremonial robes. After this mass death event, which was more murder than suicide, as most of the participants in this group didn't realize that they were going to be killed and left in a building that would be set on fire. Regardless, in total, 74 people died over the course of the multiple murders and mass murder suicides that happened because of the order of the Solar Temple. And it's not even known how many of these deaths were suicides and how many of these deaths were murders. Because the founders of this cult were killed in these rituals and any of the remaining members went into hiding, the authorities were stumped at what to do because there was nobody to charge and not much that they could do, as most of the participants were gone as well. The result was an extremely strengthened anti-cult movement in Europe, specifically in Francophone Europe. As this event was extremely publicized, the word was finally out about the danger that can be caused by cults. I suppose the one true silver lining about cults is the fact that they always seem to be self-imploding, although even a few moments of existence for the cults that I mentioned today are longer than they should have ever existed. None of these people needed to be hurt, psychologically damaged, abused, assaulted, or killed. And if anything, I hope this video shines a small light on the terrifying world of cults, manipulation, and abuse that's possible. The most haunted locations from around the world. I've touched on a lot of creepy things so far in this channel. Serial killers, mythical creatures, folklore, SCPs, but I've never discussed ghosts directly. But today, that changes. And I'm gonna answer all your questions about these haunted locations. Like, how did it become haunted? What ghostly encounters have been recorded? And are these places even really haunted? The year is 1835. And you have just been invited to a beautiful Christmas get-together at one of your friends' manors in the English countryside. The manor was just absolutely beautiful, and this party was packed with notable people. Respected colonels, wealthy businessmen, and high-ranking government officials. The night consisted of seemingly endless food and drinks and music, and everything was just so perfect. Late into the night, once the party started to die down, you and a group of friends decided that it was time to go to bed, and you all went your own separate ways to get to your bedrooms. You turn down a hallway and you're finally by yourself and only steps away from your bedroom, when you notice down this hallway there's this woman, a woman that was wearing only brown clothing. You didn't recognize this woman from the party, but this isn't your house, and you didn't know everybody at this party, so you figured it was somebody else also going to their room. This woman was slightly notable due to the apparel that she was wearing, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and you continued to your room and had a good night's rest. You woke up the following morning on Christmas Eve and engaged in the morning festivities. The party was still not done. There was a huge brunch being served, and you and everybody else were not going to miss it. You sit down at a table with some of your friends, one of which being a colonel, and he mentions that last night he saw a rather peculiar woman. Another person at your table asks, what did she look like? And the colonel goes on to explain that on his way to his bedroom, he saw a woman dressed exclusively in brown robes. These robes were dated and tattered and had to have been at least from the previous century. It didn't look right at all. And the colonel was concerned because this woman might have been somebody who either snuck into the manor or was somebody who was obviously lost. But the colonel mentioned once he spotted this woman and walked closer to her and then tried approaching her, he realized this woman had turned around and he got a look at her face. And that's when he claimed that he saw this woman's bright white face with empty eye sockets, and the man was terrified. He didn't scream or run away, but he quickly made his way to his room without asking any more questions. Instantly, your heart dropped to your stomach because you also saw the same woman, but you didn't see her face. And before you could say anything, another woman at the table says, I also saw a lady dressed up in brown. I didn't see her face, but she was standing in the hallway, not saying anything and not moving. And your heart and stomach only sank deeper. You noticed that the host of the party was sitting beside you, and her face was in shock. You asked her, who is this lady wearing these brown rags? And she confessed that she had absolutely no idea. The Christmas party was a formal event and everybody was dressed in their absolute best. Nobody was wearing brown, and there was nobody in the party with sunken in, missing eyeballs. The host of this party quickly stands up on her chair and started clinking a spoon on her glass, causing the conversation in the room to a silence. And the host of the party asked, did anybody see a woman in brown robes anywhere in the manor last night? And to her dismay, numerous people in this room of nearly 100 people raised their hand. The story I just just told is based on a real documented encounter that happened in 1835 at a Christmas party. And this story is significant because it is the first recorded sighting of the ghost that is now known as the Brown Lady at the iconic Raynham Hall. And this isn't the only sighting that's taken place, and it's probably not even the most iconic either. And only days after this event, when the host of the party made the staff aware of all of these claims, people literally quit their jobs and never returned out of fear of encountering this strange apparition. But that's not it. There was a handful of sightings on that night in 1835, but the following year in 1836, Captain Franklin Marryat, who is actually a friend of Charles Dickens, heard tell of the legend of this brown lady in the Raynham Manor and spoke to the owner directly and requested that he stay in the most haunted room of them all so he could prove that there was no ghost at all and that this legend simply came to be because the owner of this manor wanted to keep people away from his property. And let's just say he got more than he bargained for. This captain checked into the hotel and stayed in a room that literally had a painting of the apparition hung in the room. Like I mentioned, at this point, the Brown Lady was already a local legend and a common sighting within the hotel. And for the first 2 nights of his visit, the captain had a normal experience. He was staying in a hotel and rather comically was sleeping with a loaded revolver under his pillow just in case. And it was after the second night and the beginning of the third night when everything began to change. Because on night 3, Frederick didn't get a good night's sleep at all. What he did get was a run-in with the Brown Lady. Frederick had just gotten into bed and was ready to go to sleep when he noticed something in front of his door. The door never opened, but there was obviously a shadow of some sort in front of the door blocking the path. The shadow was moving and getting bigger until Frederick realized that this shadow was exactly what he was looking for. He quickly looked at the painting on the wall and noticed that this was the Brown Lady, and she was in his room and she was getting closer to him. Frederick grabs the revolver from under his pillow, points it at the apparition, and screams at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Don't come closer! I'm going to shoot!" But the Brown Lady grew a menacing grin and began to get closer, practically at the foot of his bed, when Frederick pulled the trigger, shot the revolver into the darkness, and the apparition disappeared. 3 hotel workers came into the room to ask what had just happened, and Frederick left the hotel and never returned. I tried to only tell one story per section, but I figured that story was kind of worth going into detail over. Over the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a plethora of other run-ins with the Brown Lady, which brings us to Captain Hubert C. Prevant, who not only had a run-in with the Brown Lady, but was able to capture a picture of her, a full-body apparition. And this photo is not only iconic to the Raynham Hall, but it's also one of the most iconic photos in all of ghost hunting. This photo was taken in 1936, and since this photo has been taken, sightings have been few and far between, although many people still believe to this day that Raynham Hall is haunted. Once again, just a crazy story, but you might be thinking, okay, sure, there's this ghost there, but who is this lady and how did she get there? And because this section's getting long, let me boil it down. According to the legend of the Brown Lady, the Townsend family, which was the family that owned the Raynham Manor, after numerous run-ins with this apparition, was able to identify her from one of the paintings that was displayed within the manor. The woman was named Dorothy Walpole, who lived from 1686 to 1726, and was the sister of Robert Walpole, who is considered the first ever Prime Minister of Great Britain. She was the second wife of Charles Townshend, one of the original Townsends that owned the manor, and this man was well known for having a short temper. Allegedly, this man had caught Dorothy with another man, a lord, and as punishment, he locked her in her room in the manor, and she was never allowed to leave. She wasn't allowed to see friends, family, or even her own children. She was a prisoner in her own home until 1926 when she passed away from smallpox. Obviously, that story is upsetting both ways, because if Dorothy did cheat, then that's awful. But Charles had absolutely no right to do any of that whatsoever. If somebody cheats on you, you just break up with them. You say, hey, you get out of my manor, we're done. You don't say, hey, I'm gonna trap you in this room until you die. To this day, Raynham Hall is one of the most iconic haunted locations in all of England. But this is one of the more tame entries on the list, and we're only just getting started. It's the mid-1800s, and you are a medical doctor, Dr. Charles Finney. You live in Atchison, Kansas, and you run a successful medical operation out of your home. This home was something your family recently commissioned, and now you were both living in it and making it your place of business, at least for now. And everything was going smoothly until one night. You were in bed, exhausted after a long day, with your eyes feeling like they're each 1,000 pounds, just begging to be closed. And as you're on the verge of sleep, about to drift off, you hear a knocking at your door. This was extremely uncommon. You obviously had no appointments in the dead of night, and you had no idea who this could be. Reluctantly, you get out of bed and head to your front door. And when you open the door, you notice a woman standing there, holding her young daughter. This woman is frantic and explains that her daughter is in severe pain, and she can't walk, can't move, and she is in endless, excruciating pain coming from her abdomen. The doctor's fatigue instantly wears off, and he's back in work mode. And he invites the woman and the daughter in and quickly takes them to his basement examination room, where he's able to identify the likely source of all of this pain, an inflamed appendix that was about to burst. The doctor informed the mother that this young girl needed emergency surgery now, and the mother agreed, saying, "Please, anything to save my daughter." The doctor quickly prepped the location, washed his hands, grabbed his tools, and then began to administer the anesthesia. Once everything was ready and the medicine was administered, the doctor hastily made the first incision. Although little did he know, the anesthesia that he had administered was an improper dose, and this girl, who was already in pain, was now in even more pain, as she could feel everything. And this incision that the doctor had just made was the final straw. Her body went into shock, and not long after, she passed away on that operating table. That young girl's name was Sally, and this story is the reason why this location is known as the Sally House. First thing I'm going to say right off the bat is, as interesting as that story is, there is absolutely no recorded evidence for that story actually being true. And it's largely regarded as a folktale, loosely based in reality. Dr. Charles Finney was a real doctor, and he worked in Atchison, Kansas. And he lived out of his practice that his family had recently commissioned. That all is true. But as far as the story of Sally is concerned, there was no physical evidence. But the reason I mention the story is because it is the story that is most associated with this haunted location. And this haunted location is one of the most iconic in all of the United States of America. So yeah, I wanted to make that distinction primarily because I knew if I didn't, others would say that's not actually true, and well, it's not proven either way, but it is highly debated and not proven that it did happen, so I'll let you make up your mind on that. That story is upsetting and sad, but what does it have to do with haunted locations? Well, that story is kind of where everything began, because after this incident that may or may not have happened in the late 1800s, experiences in the Sally House have been vast and plentiful. Some experiences only consist of hearing a creak or faint footsteps, or even the giggle of a young girl. But other encounters are a lot more sinister, with items being thrown, loud screams being heard, and even visitors being scratched to the point of bleeding. Nearly every former tenant or owner of the Sally House that had been interviewed alleged to have experienced paranormal activity of some sort, typically with consistent attributes across all of the accounts, with some even claiming to see Sally in the window at night when it was known that nobody was home. If you're watching this video, you're probably into the paranormal, which means you've probably seen some of your favorite ghost YouTubers stay in this house. Sam and Colby, Nick and Ryan, Exploring with Josh, or even large-scale TV productions. All of these people have stayed in the Sally House and had unique experiences. So for that reason, I'm not going to go too much more into detail. But I will say this, the Sally House hasn't been anybody's personal residence since the 1990s, and in more recent times has been a popular tourist attraction, which kind of makes you think, is the legend of the Sally House real? Or do people just want to keep the story alive because there's a financial incentive? Regardless, the Sally House is regarded as one of the most iconic haunted locations in the United States. The year is 1885. You and your wife are pioneers in New South Wales, Australia, and you have just finished building a double-story late Victorian-style manor on the top of a hill overlooking your local town. This was you and your wife's dream homestead, and you built it with your very own hands. The construction was a labor of love, and now you could enjoy this manor for the rest of your life. This manor became known as the Monte Cristo Homestead, and you and your wife enjoyed it up until your deaths. After you and your wife were long gone and your family had no longer lived in the residence, the house essentially was left abandoned. There were caretakers, but unfortunately, the Monte Cristo Homestead fell into disrepair. That was until it was purchased by another couple, Reg and Olive Ryan, and they were dedicated to building this beautiful manor back to its former glory, and that's exactly what they did. They took it from a derelict, abandoned home to something that was actually habitable. And once again, the homestead was a home again. And it wasn't long after Reg and Olive moved in that things began to get weird. One late night, only a few days after the Ryans had officially moved in, they were heading home after an event, when they noticed that as they approached their house, they could see bright lights beaming from inside the house, illuminating all of the windows. This caught Reg and Olive's attention, and they were both speechless at what they were looking at. Reg knew that the electricity wasn't even fully finished in the house yet, and for the places that did have electricity, he knew he left no lights on and no lamps burning. Olive was just in sheer terror, and the couple stopped halfway up their driveway in pure awe of what they were looking at. Their home illuminated in the middle of the night for no reason at all. Terrified, the couple approached the house, and the closer they got, the dimmer the the lights got. And by the time they actually reached their new home, the house wasn't illuminated at all, and it was as dark as it should have been. The couple theorized that maybe they were just seeing the reflections of the headlight of their vehicle, but deep down they knew that wasn't what they saw at all. And this was only the beginning of the strange encounters that were going to take place over the next few years. Following this event, when the family decided to bring their family cat to their new home, instantly the cat was uncomfortable, which is common. This cat's in a new environment and was just in a car ride, something it didn't enjoy. But as soon as your wife put the cat on the floor, it arched its back and moaned in fear as if it was face to face with another cat. There was nothing there. The cat hissed and screamed and immediately ran out of the house. You, your wife, and your 3 daughters looked for the cat and never found your cat again. Following that event, there was numerous occasions where your daughters claimed that they could see a man's face out the window, which was impossible considering that all of your daughters had bedrooms on the 2nd floor, and there was never any unknown men near or around the property. The family frequently encountered disembodied voices and footsteps and noises, doors opening and drawers closing, and there was truly no explanation for any of it. After years of alleged strange and ghostly encounters, the homestead was converted into a museum, where it showcased antiques, local treasures, and became a tourist attraction with a gift shop, and became known as Australia's most haunted house. Since then, it was featured in numerous TV shows in the 70s, 90s, and early 2000s and 2010s. But very recently, in January of 2025, the homestead was actually closed to the public as Olive Ryan passed away. The Monte Cristo homestead is likely one of the most famous haunted houses in all of Australia. And whether or not the paranormal experiences actually happened to Reg and Olive, or if they just made up stories to have a way to make money off of the house they just restored, I'll let you decide. The year is 1907, and the Dutch have just finished building a beautiful office building for their railway developments in Indonesia. Why the Dutch had a rail company and headquarters in Indonesia is a different conversation. But regardless, this building existed, and it looks really cool, and operated until 1942. That's because the Japanese invaded Indonesia, and they wanted everything, including this beautiful office building. You might be asking yourself, did the Japanese just use it as their office building? Now it's their headquarters in Indonesia? And the answer is no, because once they had total control of this building, they turned an entire wing of the building into a dungeon, specifically for torture and executions, something that wasn't uncommon for the Japanese in World War II. From 1942 until 1945, the building was under Japanese control, until Dutch forces tried to overtake the building from the Japanese. And in October of 1945, a battle took place within the building from Dutch troops who entered through a tunnel underground. Although the Dutch weren't only fighting the Japanese, they were also fighting the Indonesians. And the battle lasted 3 days, and the Dutch eventually retreated. Once World War II ended, the Indonesian army took control of the complex, and it was restored and given back to the Indonesian Railway Company, not the Dutch Railway Company. And in 1992, it was officially considered cultural property of Indonesia. From 1992 until 2009, this building was essentially left to rot, and over this time, it was vandalized, and nature had begun to take it back, with mold growing, parts of the building collapsing and falling apart, and locals beginning to have interesting stories regarding this building. This building, with quite the history, is known as Lawang Sewu, and it is considered one of the most haunted locations in all of Indonesia. Lawang Sewu is very interesting, and its history alone is something to be researched and talked about. During the time that this building was left in disarray, many local teenagers would make it a challenge to touch the building, or go near the building, or go inside the building, or even in extreme cases, stay overnight in the building. This massive building with such a dark and long history became a bit of an icon for all the wrong reasons, and everyone essentially considered it to be an evil, haunted building with dark energy and dark spirits associated with it, which kind of makes sense. Like, just imagine how dark the energy is being in a building, knowing the history. The unspeakable things that happened in this building, I could only imagine left some sort of energetic residue. Regardless, this building became very popular with thrill seekers in Indonesia. And it was over this near 20-year stretch when this building was falling apart that people had many strange encounters within the walls. Hearing voices, hearing footsteps, seeing apparitions, being scratched, being touched. All of these took place within the walls. The Indonesian government actually had plans of restoring this building, but were hesitant to do so because they feared that nobody would use or interact with the building because of the fear associated with it being haunted. But against their better judgment, they continued with the restoration project. And from 2009 to 2011, the building was restored. And in 2013, the building was officially open for tours. And currently, it's a massive hit for tourism in the region of Java, Indonesia, and sees over 1,000 visitors every single day. Now, here's the thing that's kind of interesting about this building. The government has official plans to, quote, eliminate the spooky image in order to attract more visitors, which I think is interesting because that's kind of the opposite of what most ghost house owners want, right? Like, they want to not only maintain but amplify the spooky image in order to bring in people. But I guess the difference is they are wanting to make this a historical landmark, but they are fearing that this image could scare people away, as especially in this region of the world, people are extremely superstitious when it comes to spirits. And there are plenty of locals that avoid this building entirely, as they fear that going near or around this building could lead a spirit to follow you to your home and essentially bring you bad luck and negative energy. So yeah, Loang Sewu over the last 120 years has had a very long and interesting and unfortunate history, including colonization, war, torture, executions, and other unspeakable things, I'm sure. But as the government allowed this building to sit and rot, the locals decided to have some fun and found a little bit more than fun. And today, the government has restored this building to make it a historical landmark and are doing their best to make sure that nobody talks about the whole ghost part of this building, which is kind of funny. Definitely one of the more obscure entries in this list. Before we get to the last entry on this list, I just wanted to make a quick point. Originally, this video was supposed to have 10 entries, not 5. But because it takes so long to animate the stories associated with each of these sections, I decided to just essentially cut it in half. I didn't want to sacrifice the storytelling or the information for the sake of having more entries on the list. I say this because there is a ton of other crazy, obscure haunted locations that I want to talk about. So consider this video a part 1, and if you guys want that second part, leave a like or leave a comment and I will post another video about the craziest and most obscure haunted locations from around the world. Now, back to the final entry of this list. The year is 1776. You are a healthy adult man living in Venice, Italy. You have a beautiful wife and a newborn son, and unfortunately you are experiencing the harsh wrath of the plague. It's killed numerous friends and family members of yours, but fortunately you, your wife, and your son are safe. For now at least, because you have to work every single day to be able to afford to live. Your family depends on you, and you try to be as safe as possible. That is, until you catch the plague. At this point in time, the government had a protocol for anybody who had caught the plague. And your fate was to be sent to the island of Poveglia, an island that at this point the Italian government was using solely as a quarantine station for those with the plague and other diseases. And that is where you went. You weren't able to say goodbye to your wife or son as it would pose too much risk to them, and you felt confident that if you went to this island, you would quarantine and come back a healthy man and return to your family. But unfortunately, almost as soon as you were shipped to this island, you were never heard from again. Your son was able to grow up through the plague and survive it. As time went on, the plague began to go away. Things began to change. One of the bigger changes that happened was the Italian government was no longer using Poveglia as a quarantine station, but as a remote mental institution. And unfortunately, your son, through the trauma that he experienced growing up in the plague, losing his father, and other hardships that he had in his life, found himself also on the island of Poveglia. This time, not because of the plague, but because of a mental disorder that was at the time not understood. The island of Poveglia at this point had claimed the lives of multiple generations in your family. But sadly, this wasn't unique to your family. Tens of thousands of people had perished on Poveglia Island. And it's because of that dark and death-filled history that Poveglia Island is regarded as not only one of the most haunted locations in Italy, but one of the most haunted locations in the entire world. From the late 1300s until the late 1900s, this small island was inhabited by people and used for multiple different reasons. The two primary reasons, the quarantine station and the mental asylum. There was likely an unspeakable amount of atrocities that took place on this island, and it's for that reason that after it was abandoned, people gained quite the interest in visiting it. The mental hospital was the last official use of this island, but when that institution closed in 1968, not only the building went abandoned, but the entire island became abandoned, leaving the buildings, the belongings, and the history to marinate. But it didn't take long for history buffs and thrill seekers to check it out for themselves. And that's when the legend began to grow of how haunted Poveglia Island really was. I've actually watched a video of somebody not doing a ghost hunt here, but just exploring the island. I believe it was Exploring with Josh I watched, and it's kind of unfortunate because although the history of this island is rather dark, the architecture is still beautiful, and the island itself is really unique. I could only imagine it would be a cool cool tourist attraction. Kind of like the Italian version of Alcatraz. You know how that had a really dark history but became a popular tourist attraction. Even though this entire island has been off limits from the day it closed to today, it's not stopped people from going. And it appears that almost everybody who has gone there has come back with a story, which has led to numerous different paranormal TV shows and even paranormal YouTubers to explore the island for themselves. There are no real famous notable claims of hauntings or specific apparitions on this island. There is just a general consensus among people who have been there that there is no doubt that this island is haunted, which they back up with the history of the building itself. This is definitely an example of a haunted location that I'd be more willing to take seriously simply because there's no financial incentive. This isn't something that somebody owns. Nobody's really gonna make money off of making a legend out of this. It is an abandoned building with a dark history that I'm sure the Italian government just wanted to kind of decay into nothingness. Hey, do you wanna know a scary thought? You know, like serial killers? Well, before they were all caught and put in jail or even executed, you know that they were just living in public with the rest of us, right? Yeah, creepy. Not too long ago, I covered the topic of serial killers that were never caught. Some of these were more recent, but a lot of them were older cold cases. If you haven't seen that video, it's linked in the description for you to watch after this one. But what I want to do in today's video is go a little bit deeper and discuss currently active serial killers that are still on the loose, meaning that they are very much so alive and very much so free and very much so still in the habit of murdering people. Now buckle up and let's get started. We are starting this list with an individual known as the Jeff Davis 8 killer. In the mid to late 2000s, the Jefferson Davis Parish in Louisiana was thrust into the national spotlight due to a string of unsolved murders. 8 women, now known as the Jefferson 8, were killed and dumped into swamps and canals around the city of Jennings over only a 4-year period. The connections between these victims in this case is striking, as all 8 victims were discovered to have known each other quite well, and 2 of them were even cousins. The victims at some point in their lives had also acted as police informants and even reported on each other at times. This also led to the families believing that the police were somehow involved in their deaths. That theory was further supported by the 2016 book Murder in the Bayou. But as far as we are concerned, right now there is absolutely no leads on who could be the killer or killers involved in murdering these 8 women. The chance of this killer still being at large is extremely high. What do you guys think? Simply rural towns being underfunded and not being able to solve a complex series of murders? Or did the local police want to get rid of their string of informants? Hence, all of them disappearing and no evidence being found, and a large delay in there even being an acknowledgement of all of these murders being connected in one way or another. It's very fishy, and it's unfortunate that justice hasn't yet been served. Moving on, let's discuss the I-70 killer. In case you're unfamiliar, I-70 or Interstate 70 is one of the longest highways in the entire United States, connecting multiple states from Utah all the way to Maryland. And if you didn't know, those are on opposite sides of the country, so it's pretty long. However, unfortunately, in 1992, this route became the hunting ground for a dangerous individual known as the I-70 killer. The confirmed cases attributed to him include the death of 6 people who worked in convenience stores along the highway. Most of them were young women with brunette hair, with the exception of 1 male, being the only I-70 victim who was male. Because this killer found his victims on such a long stretch of highway, the police were completely unable to connect any meaningful dots. And even though the police and investigators from each respective city and county were able to compare notes, there was no solid enough evidence that allowed them to get any sort of suspect. And the most progress they were able to make was 2 composite sketches of what the killer could look like, which unfortunately never brought anyone to justice. It's honestly shocking how far technology has come and how seemingly easy it was to be a serial killer not that long ago. These cases only took place in 1992, 30 short years ago. And the fact that the composite sketches showed a young man, likely only in his 20s or 30s, the chances of this killer being out on the loose and alive and even active today is extremely likely. And look, at this point, you might be asking yourself, how can I protect myself from these killers that are still on the loose? And the answer is, I don't know. Next up, we have the Long Island serial killer. Like the rest of these cases, this one's crazy. In May of 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shannon Gilbert disappeared, so the police conducted a search looking for her along the Ocean Parkway in Long Island, New York. And while unfortunately they did not find her body, they found something they did not expect at all. They found the remains of 4 other missing women. What started out as a simple search for missing women turned into the investigation of a lifetime, searching for a serial killer who's currently on the loose. Over the course of a few extra months, police found more remains belonging to 6 other people, a total of 10, and the connections were made. The killer mostly targeted sex workers who put up ads on Craigslist. And although there was a lot of effort put into a lengthy investigation, and there was even suspects and persons of interest, which is a first on this list so far, there was absolutely no arrests made, and the Long Island serial killer may very well be still active, as they're still on the loose. Truly sad and unfortunate. Alright, let's get out of the States for a sec and go over to Asia, specifically Japan. This entry is not only strange, but but also really scary, and you'll see why very soon. As some of you may know, Japan has a huge obsession with vending machines. It's a huge part of their culture, and it's honestly pretty cool and convenient to have so many cool things readily available almost everywhere. On average, there's one vending machine for every 23 people. That's a pretty high ratio. But between April and November 1985 in Hiroshima, 12 people were killed and another 35 were injured due to paraquat poisoning. What is paraquat, you may ask? Well, it's a popular herbicide or weed killer. When the authorities started to investigate all of these deaths, they started to notice one thing in common. They all had consumed a drink called Ornamic C. Now, at the time, Ornamic C had a marketing campaign going on where if you made a purchase at one of their vending machines, you would get an Ornamic C for free. It was a type of orange beverage. In Japanese culture, sometimes the people would place the free drink on the top of the vending machine so someone else could take it if they didn't want it. The police soon caught on and figured out that someone had been tampering with these free drinks on the top of the machine, poisoning them with paraquat. It was almost impossible for the police to track down anybody responsible, and because there was already so many fingerprints on the drink from the person who originally got it to all of the people that may have touched it, and the lack of CCTV at the time, there was almost no evidence. And unfortunately, this person was never found. It's very likely this person could still be around today, and whether they're a serial poisoner or not, I would say there's a good chance that they're probably up to no good. I don't know about you, but this definitely makes me question any type of free drink I may be offered in the near future. Well, unfortunately, we couldn't stay out of the States for too long, and now we're back discussing the Eastbound Strangler. This name has a very odd and gruesome origin. In November of 2006, 4 bodies were found in a drainage ditch near Atlantic City, New Jersey. These bodies would all be identified as women who earned a living as sex workers in the area. The women all were lined up and appeared to be strangled, hence the strangler part of the name, but strangely enough, all of their bodies were facing eastbound, which is why they called him the Eastbound Strangler. It's a strange name with an even stranger meaning, but what's most strange is that this killer was never caught. Keep in mind, this case happened in 2006, not 1985, so there was a decent amount of technology to help solve this case. And for that reason, there was DNA evidence that was retrieved, but unfortunately, all this DNA evidence was able to do was clear the names of the only suspects that they had because there was no match. Despite there being a $25,000 reward, the Eastbound Strangler was never found and very likely walks among us today. I don't know about you guys, but if somebody goes and strangles 4 innocent people, I would say that they're probably not just going to stop at that, which is why I considered them for this list of active killers. And for good measure, let's just add one more strangler, specifically the Chicago Strangler. From 2001 all the way up till 2018, the deaths of at least 50 women in the south and west sides of Chicago have had the Chicago PD stumped. Like in other cases, unfortunately, a lot of these victims shared very similar attributes. They were African-American female sex workers in the area, and as you might have assumed, they were all murdered via strangulation. Because a lot of these victims in cases have provided no suspects, the term Chicago Strangler has been used as somewhat of a blanket term to identify the killer or killers who are still at large. The silver lining of this case is that some of these cases have been solved and closed, but unfortunately a vast majority of these strangulation victims have not been given justice, and unfortunately they likely won't. In 2019, a task force was set up to reinvestigate the cases. Somewhat strangely, in my opinion, they have not been able to provide any evidence to validate the theory that there is one perpetrator, meaning that they believe there's either multiple perpetrators or simply no connection between the cases. And for me, I believe that there's too much in common between all of these cases for these to simply be coincidental and completely unrelated. But what do you guys think? It's very sad and disheartening and honestly scary that this sort of thing is still going on, and the fact that these situations were still happening up until 2018 leads me to believe that this is still happening to this day. And for the last entry on this list, we will be jumping over to Russia. We have the Danilovsky Maniac, or the Maniac with Dull Eyes. He gets the nickname from a vague description given to the police, and he's on this list because between 2004 and 2007 he killed at least 7 women. He's also been believed to be active as early as 1999 and as recent as 2010. Like basically every monster on this list, he targeted young women, assaulted them, and murdered them, and hid their bodies in construction sites around Cherpovets, Russia. This killer left crude drawings at crime scenes to taunt the police, and even with over 200 people being interrogated and a reward of over 500,000 rubles, the identity of the maniac was never solved, and unfortunately, he is still very likely among us today. One very important note I want to make at the end of this video is that all of the victims in this video are real, and all of these situations are very real and very unfortunate. And with that, I try to be as respectful as possible when covering sensitive topics like this. The scariest mythical creatures that probably existed. That is exactly what we're going to be talking about today, and this list is spooky. If you're new here, this is actually the 3rd video in my Scariest Mythical Creatures series, but you don't need to have watched those videos to understand this video. Each of my mythical creatures videos is a new list, and just like the other lists, this list starts scary and gets even scarier as the video goes on, and all of these creatures are from different parts of the world. Let's begin. Starting off in the birthplace of freedom, we have Mothman from the US of A. Mothman is one of the most recently discovered creatures on this list, with his story only originating in 1966, relatively recently compared to some of the entries on this list. Mothman was first spotted in the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, but his legend has grown immensely over the years. Early witnesses described Mothman as a large black creature with glowing red eyes, 7 to 10 feet tall and muscular. They claimed it appeared bird-like in nature, but was much too big to be a bird. Something interesting about the Mothman lore is that sightings really only took place from November 15th, 1966 to December 15th, 1967, meaning that there was only about 13 months of sightings. December 15th is actually a pretty significant date when it comes to Point Pleasant history. It was the date of a rather tragic event. The Silver Bridge, also known as the Point Pleasant Bridge, a bridge that connected West Virginia and Ohio, collapsed. Not only did it collapse, but it collapsed during rush hour traffic. This resulted in the death of 46 people and the permanent loss of 2 bodies. Now, why am I bringing up the Silver Bridge incident? Well, it's because in 1975, the book by John Keel, The Mothman Prophecies, claimed that not only was there paranormal events related to the sightings, but that there was also a connection to Mothman and the collapse of the bridge. To me, that's a pretty serious claim. During the 13 months of active Mothman sightings, there was hundreds, and later on it was revealed that there was over 100 people that were too scared to even admit that they saw the Mothman. With that being said, I put Mothman as number 1 on the list because I believe that he is definitely scary, but his intentions are too unknown to be truly evil. Although some things have been attributed to him, the only real claims that can be made against him is that he was standing there menacingly, and also the fact that he would potentially bang on the roofs of teenagers' cars. If you've seen any of our other videos, you know that these are extremely tame actions for a mythical creature, and I also believe that the Mothman could have very well existed simply because of all of the evidence there is and how passionate the Point Pleasant community is. This city has a big sculpture of the Mothman in its downtown. Like, this is the one thing to happen in Point Pleasant, and they are not living it down. My personal thoughts on the matter are that since he was only seen for a short amount of time, I think it's very possible that this could have been someone playing an elaborate prank or trying to be a superhero for a short amount of time until they got bored of it. But even if Mothman is some sort of supernatural being, I believe the scariest thing about him is his appearance. And for that reason, he is only number 1 on the list. And like I mentioned earlier, this video gets scarier as we go on. So let's move on. Second, we have Nixie. The Nixie stems from Scandinavian and German origins. These creatures almost always depict a human female, but they can vary from looking like an old woman with green teeth, skin, and hair to looking like a beautiful woman with green teeth, skin, and hair. They are also often covered in moss, seaweed, and seashells. Although Nixies are sometimes described as having a fish tail in the water, they can appear on land in full humanoid form. But one tell that always gives them away is that their clothes are always slightly damp and dripping water. Nixies are commonly described as nymphs or water sprites or even mermaids, and all of which are technically correct, but I believe that most people would probably identify what I've already described as a mermaid. The one thing that makes the Nixie rather unique is the fact that the lore is much older and dates way further back, and also their unique abilities. Some traits that the Nixie shares with mermaids is their infatuation with humans and their beauty and songs used to seduce sailors, typically into danger. But that isn't always the case. Some Nixies require an annual human sacrifice. Some Nixies have a lust for humans, which has a romantic and not deadly ending, which I won't get into any further detail, but you can imagine. Nixies also have the unique ability to control the weather if irritated. With all of this being said, I think the Nixies are very interesting and infatuating, but I definitely think they are scarier than Mothman for the simple reason that they have more malice intent. Typically, not always, but typically. Whereas with Mothman, we have no reported deaths or requirements of sacrifice. He's not a sexy green lady, but he's also not necessarily trying to drown you. So I feel like for that reason, the Nixie is a little bit scarier, but not quite as scary as our next entry from Down Under. I'm of course talking about the Bunyip, not the Bunyin. That's something else. The Bunyip. Originating from Aboriginal mythology of southeastern Australia, the Bunyip is described as an amphibious creature lurking in waterbeds, swamps, creeks, and other watery places. Although physical descriptions of the bunyip vary drastically, the most common descriptions typically include a round head, an elongated neck, and the body resembling an ox or a hippopotamus or even a manatee. The bunyip has also been reported to make roaring or booming noises. The bunyip inhabits and protects these shallow waters and preys upon anyone who dares go near them. One thing that I find pretty ironic is that the bunyip sometimes is described as having glowing red eyes and also drowning people. So if you really think about it, it's kind of a combination of Mothman and Nixie, the best of both worlds. Or the worst, I guess. The story of the bunyip and different accounts and drawings have existed for hundreds of years, adding a lot to its validity of its actual history. And although it's never been proven to exist, there are many that would argue the bunyip is very real. That, combined with the fact that the bunyip is definitely the most violent creature so far on the list, I'd have to give it the number 3 spot. Any huge creature with huge claws, glowing red eyes, chilling in the water, just waiting to rip you to shreds is pretty scary in my book. The bunyip is terrifying, and who knows? It might just be real too, but let's hope not. Next up, we have what may be the silliest little guy on the entire list. We have the Tokoloshe, or the Tikalosh, from South Africa. Physically, the Tokoloshe resembles a dwarf-like or even goblin-like water spirit. It is a mischievous and evil spirit that can become invisible by only drinking water or swallowing a stone, which is weird. Could you just imagine like 2 Tokoloshes? It's like their time to go be mischievous, and one of them's like, hey, let's go invisible, let's go drink water, and the other guy's just like, no, I think I'm gonna swallow the stone. And the other guy's like, are you sure? We could just drink this water. And he's like, no, I like swallowing the stone. I guess no one said they were normal. I know I've kept this segment light so far, but the true reality of the Tokoloshe is rather dark. The Tokoloshe's sole purpose is to cause humans harm and discomfort at the very least. At its least harmful, a Tokoloshe can be used to scare children, but its true power can be used to cause illness and even death to its victim. Now, if you caught what I said there, you might be questioning, what do you mean they can be used by? Who's using the Tokoloshes? Well, Tokoloshes are called upon by malevolent people used to cause trouble to others. These goblin-like creatures are essentially people's henchmen to do their dirty work. These benevolent people are typically witches, focusing specifically on dark magic. And whatever jobs these witches task these Tokoloshes with, they will do until completion. And during the night, they will execute their plan. A really interesting part about Tokoloshe lore is how commonly it's been used in legal situations in South Africa, specifically as a scapegoat for robbery, assault, and murder. I don't know about you, but a short, green, powerful being that could be invisible, appearing in your house in the night that can cause you anything from a slight discomfort to death sounds pretty scary to me. And the fact that there's not only just headlines, but court cases involving the Tokoloshe as the suspect is the reason why it's included on this list on creatures that probably existed. The biggest reason why I put the Tokoloshe above the bunyip is the simple fact that the bunyip can simply be avoided by not going to a swamp at night. The Tokoloshe is something that if it's set on you, you're not escaping. And your only real hope is that its intention is just something mischievous and not worse. But it gets worse with our next entry, El Silbón, or the Whistler. El Silbón is a Colombian and Venezuelan folklore creature who might have the worst backstory we've heard yet. The legend states that El Silbón started as a young boy who was a spoiled brat whose parents catered to his every wish. One night he demanded his father hunt him a deer as it was his favorite meat, but his father didn't return home that night with the deer. The son killed his father and cut out his organs. He gave these organs to his mother to cook for dinner. His mother cooked them, and as they ate them, she realized the meat tasted off. She began to ask where her husband was, and she soon put the dots together. Obviously, she was shocked, and things did not go well. The mother cursed her son for eternity, and afterwards, his grandfather had ordered him to be tied up to a post in the middle of the countryside. He lashed his back open until his back was destroyed. The grandfather placed alcohol, chili peppers, and lemon juice in his wounds, and then he put his father's organs in a bag and placed it on the boy's back. The grandfather released 2 rabid dogs upon him, but before he released the dog, the grandfather condemned the boy to carry the bag of his father's remains for eternity. From that point on, the boy was now El Silbón, a 3 to 6 meter tall, skeleton-like creature with a bag of bones on its back, with a bloodlust and a vengeance. Why do they call him El Silbón, or the Whistler? It's because he whistles a very specific tune with the musical notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and then B in that order. It is said that if you hear this tone, it is a sign of your death. They say if you hear the whistle close to you, your death is far away. But they say if the whistle is in the distance and faint, your death is closer than you think. The Whistler is typically known to target drunks and womanizers, but it's not uncommon for him to
target innocent victims as well. The Whistler uses the element of surprise and typically jumps out of trees. He rips his victims to shreds and adds their bones and remains to the bag on his back, forever carrying all of his victims with him. I don't know about you, but if I heard a very faint whistle and looked around and then saw a 3-meter tall skeleton-like creature jump out of a tree and rip my bones out, I wouldn't be too happy about it. You might think this story is a bit over the top, but if you talk to any resident of the Los Llanos region of the East Andes in Colombia and Venezuela, I think you'd hear some convincing stories. Kuchi Sake Ona, the slit-mouth woman. That is the second last entry on this list, and one of the most terrifying by far. The slit-mouth woman is a malevolent figure from Japanese folklore. She is described as a malicious spirit in the form of a woman with long, straight black hair, pale skin, and scissors or some sort of sharp object in her hand. She is otherwise beautiful, but if she removes her mask, you might change your opinion. Encounters with the slit-mouth woman are simple but gruesome and go something like this. You see her and she stops you in your tracks and asks you, "Am I pretty?" If you say no, she'll instantly kill you with the sharp object she has. Now, if you do say she's beautiful, she'll remove her mask, exposing her horribly disfigured and scarred mouth, and ask you, "How about now?" If you tell her no, she will use the sharp object to kill you. But if you agree that she is still beautiful, she'll only disfigure your face to look like hers. Some believe the split-mouth woman is a victim of violence and only seeking vengeance. Others believe that she is a yokai and this is her natural form. If the death and face mutilation wasn't scary enough to justify her position on the list, consider this. This is the only mythical creature that requires you to talk to a woman. And if that's not scary, I don't know what is. Now, we've finally made it to the last entry on this list. This is one of the most requested creatures by far ever since I released my first video, which if you haven't seen, watch it after this. Keep in mind, this is only the third installment. This is an ongoing series on the channel, and if you want to see more creatures, please comment them below. I want to make as many videos as you guys want to watch. Now, with that being said, let's get into our final creature. Not actually into it, unless that's what you're into. Regardless, our final entry is, and I can already feel some of you guys losing it right now because I'm finally talking about it. It's the Manananggal. Everybody who commented this on all of my videos must have been on a mission to give me nightmares because this is by far, almost inarguably, the scariest mythical creature of all time. At least it's gotta be up there. It's definitely the scariest one that I've covered so far. If you're from the Philippines, you know what I'm gonna be talking about. But if you're not, let me just give you a sample of the Manananggal. As you could have guessed, the Manananggal is a Filipino creature. And believe it or not, that's not the scariest part. I'm joking. The Manananggal has large, bat-like wings, a long, thin tongue, vampire-like teeth, and werewolf-like claws. Also, it's not wearing pants. Why? Because it doesn't have a bottom half. The Manananggal's organs and innards are simply dangling from below itself. To be fair, it does have a bottom half. It can just remove it at any time. During the day, the Manananggal are said to be beautiful women who live normal lives that can even be married or in relationships. But at night, they show their true form. Their arms turn into their wings, and they separate their torso from their legs, leaving their organs hanging as they fly through the night sky. They prey on sleeping people, and their favorite victim are pregnant women. They insert their long tongue into their victim, and in the case of pregnant women, they eat the fetus. And in the case of men, they eat their organs and drink their blood. Now, I don't think there's necessarily a question of why the Manananggal is so terrifying and disgusting. But you may be thinking, is this really something that probably existed? Well, let me offer this. Scholars claimed that there are architectural elements changed by the fear of the Manananggal, specifically in rural regions. Two primary changes include slanted roofs to prevent the Manananggal from landing on it, and strategically placed windows away from bedrooms for reasons you can probably assume. Bro, what are you watching? Oh, dude, I'm just watching the show about people that got killed, tortured, murdered, abused, beaten, mutilated. Why? I don't know, man. It's just so calming and peaceful, honestly. That's concerning. Whether you belong on a list or just have a morbid curiosity on how these twisted people's minds work, this video is for you. One thing to quickly note is that this list is not based off kill count alone. The scary factor is based off of their general vibe, their story, and also their methods. Let's begin. Starting off strong, we have Ted Bundy. This man is literally nightmare fuel. Why was Ted so scary? For me personally, it comes down to a few reasons. Primarily being how unassuming he came off. He was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was well educated, charismatic, charming, although he had a truly twisted and dark side that only came out once you were alone with him. Besides him being almost completely hidden in plain sight, he was also a master of escape and literally escaped police twice. And after the second time he escaped, he committed 6 more murders, which is literally insane. Something that I find completely ironic is that Ted actually attended law school for a year, which is super random, but I mean, it's not the first time something like that's happened. Once he was finally caught, he eventually admitted to over 30 murders, abducting, assaulting, and murdering young women. And during his trial, he even partially represented himself. And during his sentencing, he literally proposed to his girlfriend. This dude was loving the attention and is a complete lunatic. Next up, we have Harold Shipman, aka Dr. Death. If you thought that name was bad, trust me, it gets worse. Harold was a family doctor in the small town of Hyde in the United Kingdom. Harold was well known and well respected in his community, and a majority of his clients were the elderly. This might seem a little bit random, but this fact is very important. Now, let's kind of step back and look at his history. In his early years, he was the primary caretaker for his mother with cancer, and that led him to seeking out medical practice. He became a doctor, had a family, and had a successful practice, although he did end up developing a drug habit that almost cost him his practice. He was fined on multiple drug charges and even went to rehab, but was considered cured by the end of his treatment and was free to practice once again. Once he continued his practice is when things really began to take a turn. Specifically, elderly women began to die under his care. Shipman would use any reason possible to use a hypodermic needle on his patients, which he would use to deliver them a deadly dose of morphine, causing them to overdose. The interesting thing is this was the same medicine he gave his mother when he was younger. Like Ted Bundy, Shipman is terrifying because of how unassuming he was. Not only was he respected in the community and well known and a family man, but he was also a family doctor. Probably one of the last people that you would assume to be ending people's lives intentionally. Another really scary factor was that his patient base was so vulnerable. And unfortunately, early on, a lot of his victims were just written off because of old age. Shipman was found out because before he killed his last victim, he modified her will to have her leave everything to her family doctor, aka Shipman. Her family was suspicious and they investigated. After a thorough police investigation, it was discovered that Dr. Death was responsible for over 215 deaths. Absolutely terrifying. Third up, we have Andrei Chikatilo, aka the Rostov Ripper or the Butcher of Rostov. He was a serial killer from Soviet Russia. The fact that he was in Soviet Russia actually played a big part in the reason why he was able to go on for so long. The state-controlled media was not allowed to talk about serial killings or anything of the sort, specifically because they believed that they did not have that issue. They didn't have serial killers, they thought. They believed that to only be a Western phenomenon. Following the trend, Chikatilo was just an unassuming traveling businessman, although his urges were much deeper and much darker. And unfortunately, Chikatilo was the type of person known as a necrosadist, someone who gained arousal from pain and violence and murder. Chikatilo targeted runaways, prostitutes, and homeless people as they were considered undesirables or less dead. Over time, the evidence was undeniable and the police were starting to suspect a group was at the loose, and even the general public was starting to believe that there was a werewolf just because of how gruesome the bodies were left. Unfortunately, these investigations were not fruitful simply because they were not looking in the right places. They were literally investigating satanic cults and recent psychiatric ward alumni. It wasn't until they brought in a psychiatrist that they were able to begin making progress and realize that maybe the killer was a normal seeming businessman who could be among us. In an interesting turn of events, Chikatilo was literally caught at a bus stop talking to a potential victim and was found with Vaseline, rope, and a knife in his briefcase. Although once he was brought in, his blood did not match the DNA on the killings and he was only held for a theft he committed. It wasn't until a few years later he was once again brought back in to the police station, and at this point they knew they had to get him. Although they didn't have much evidence and time was ticking before they had to release him again, it only took a 2-hour conversation between Chikatilo and the psychiatrist to have Chikatilo crack and confess to everything. Chikatilo was responsible for the gruesome death of 56 young men and women and was sentenced to death by a bullet in the back of the head. All right, things have gotten pretty dark, but we're just getting started. Let's just take a quick breather together. It's so crazy to think about how twisted these individuals are. Something I wanted to quickly mention is that this video is in no particular order. These individuals do not deserve a ranking, and I will not be giving them one. All right, buckle up. We're jumping back in. Next up, bringing us back to the US, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer is probably one of the most infamous and well-documented serial killers of all time. If you know anything about Jeffrey Dahmer's story, it's not hard to believe why he's on this list. He is one of the most depraved individuals likely to ever exist. From a very young age, he was experiencing intense, violent thoughts, and it didn't take long for him to begin acting on them. From the years of 1978 until his arrest in 1991, Jeff had killed 17 people in uniquely horrific and gruesome ways. Jeff would drug, assault, murder, assault again, chop up, eat, and more to his victims in the bodies of his victims. Not only would he drug, assault, murder, and eat his victims, but he would also mutilate their bodies and keep parts of their body as souvenirs. He even said himself that this made him feel closer to his victims. He says that he didn't want to kill anybody, it was just his only option as he wanted companionship. According to him, his ultimate goal wasn't to murder, he simply wanted a slave who he could control completely and not have to worry about any of their wants or desires. This man was truly, truly twisted. And because there was no death penalty in Wisconsin, he was actually sentenced to 973 years in jail, although he was murdered in jail by a cellmate, thankfully. Following the trend of disgusting, disturbing cannibals, we have Joachim Kroll, a disturbing serial killer from Germany. Joachim had an IQ of 76, which is just above the line of being considered mentally challenged. Kroll would primarily find his victims by either going to smaller towns outside of where he lived, or simply strolling through and hiding in the forest waiting for victims to pass by. Kroll targeted women and young girls specifically, with his youngest victim being 5 years old. He would typically start a conversation with a victim and then shortly after strangle them to death and then assault their corpse. He shortly after began cutting chunks of his victim's body off and taking them home to eat. The bodies of his victims were typically found a few days after the incident, although they were never linked to him. And one of the most unfortunate parts of his story is that typically people close to the victim would be considered primary suspects, and there was multiple completely innocent suspects who ended their own lives out of sheer frustration and embarrassment of being considered a suspect. As I'm probably sure you've realized at this point, it's very common that a lot of these people were not necessarily deemed to be serial killers just at a first glance. Even in his own apartment building, Kroll was known as Uncle Kroll to the local children as he would give them treats and allow them to play with dolls in his apartment, which he kept to lure the children. Kroll was eventually caught after he killed a neighborhood child. He tried to dispose of the remains of this child he didn't want in the toilet in the shared bathroom, and as he left the bathroom with the toilet clogged, he told one of his neighbors not to go in there. The toilet was clogged. His neighbor still went to use the bathroom and saw the horrible mess that was in the toilet. He contacted the police, and the police quickly investigated and questioned Kroll directly. They forced their way into his apartment and saw that he was cooking a stew. Kroll quickly admitted to everything, and they noticed that the stew literally contained human remains from the victim they were searching for. This man was seriously a monster. Moving over to South America, from Colombia specifically, we have Pedro Lopez, also known as the Monster of the Andes. If you thought it was frustrating and just nonsensical how the police didn't catch any of these people earlier, you're gonna absolutely hate how the story goes. Lopez was literally found guilty of murdering 110 girls in Ecuador alone, but he also confessed to killing an additional 240 women across Peru and Colombia. Now, obviously for having over 300 alleged murders, he is obviously sentenced to death, right? No? Well, he's at least sentenced to life in prison, right? What if I told you that he was literally released on good behavior and now his whereabouts are completely unknown? I'm not making this up, by the way. Pedro Lopez was literally released in 1998 on good behavior and now his whereabouts are not known. I seriously cannot fathom whose idea this was and how they could justify this at all. On top of being somebody who just murdered hundreds of people, something that is extremely scary about this person right now is the fact that they were born in 1948, meaning that right now in 2023, if they're still alive, they're only 75 years old, meaning that if you just see an old person walking down the side of the road, they might be the monster of the Andes. Insane. This next entry on our very disturbing list brings us back to where we started in the USA. This entry is our third American and final entry. His name is John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is probably one of the most deranged individuals on this list, and if you've heard of Jeffrey Dahmer, you've probably heard of John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was a businessman and politician and was a liked and respected community figure. Like most people on this list, he was rather unassuming, and unfortunately, living a double life. Gacy had a family, a wife, a child, but that didn't stop him from assaulting young men, and although they were silent for some time out of fear for their lives, eventually they came out with their story, and Gacy was charged and imprisoned. Like the previous entry on this list, he was released on good behavior. Absolutely wild. After he was released from prison, he was essentially able to get a fresh start in life and was able to get a job, find a new wife, and start a construction company that was able to be quite lucrative, although it wasn't long until he was at his antics once again. Gacy developed an alter ego named Pogo the Clown, which allowed him to express parts of himself he felt that he had to repress. He appeared at birthday parties, community events, and did magic for children in the hospital. Unfortunately, these displays only brought him closer to his darker self. Gacy began cruising around at night in his full clown getup and would force young boys to get in his vehicle at gunpoint and then assault them and murder them and bury them in his basement. Gacy was eventually caught because his basement was so full of bodies. His last victim he actually had to ditch in a local river. This body was shortly after found, and the police were able to connect the dots and immediately began investigating Gacy. It wasn't long before they got a warrant, searched the basement, and found the bodies. It's interesting because Gacy always denied the accusations and even claimed that the bodies in his basement was a setup to destroy his political career. This man was a complete lunatic.
The scariest creepypastas that terrified us as kids. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Being at my friend's house at a sleepover, hanging out in the pillow fort we just built, watching scary videos on his iPad mini. Videos that subsequently caused my friend to pee the bed, and me to call my mom crying because I couldn't sleep. The videos that we were watching were people reading creepypastas, and at the time, they were the most terrifying thing a young bro could imagine. Whether a similar situation happened to you a decade ago, or maybe even last week, if you can relate to watching creepypastas late at night, then today's video is going to be nostalgic. But in case you're unfamiliar with creepypastas at all, and you've never been exposed to any of the original stories, don't worry, because you're about to get a masterclass in early internet horror culture. And if you're still confused on what a creepypasta even is, it's really just an online horror story that got shared around a lot. The intro story I just told was not a creepypasta. It was real. I truly do still remember it to this day because this sleepover really opened my eyes to online horror, although in a very unfortunate way. Mainly because the person I was sleeping over with, I was sharing a bed with. And not only did they pee the bed, but they peed on me. So in retaliation, I peed on them in their bed. Just kidding. Or am I? Regardless, the creepypasta that caused us both so much distress was one of the most iconic of all time. It is known as Jeff the Killer. And since this creepypasta traumatized me most as a kid, it deserves the first spot on this list. Looking back at it, after recently rereading the Jeff the Killer creepypasta, it's kind of hilarious how much this scared me, considering how poorly the story is actually written. And there's a good chance that the person who wrote the Jeff the Killer creepypasta was no older than 14. If you're unfamiliar, the Jeff the Killer creepypasta all kind of orbits around this one singular image. An image of a disfigured person with bright white skin, deep black eyes, a wide red smile, and thin black hair. The image, admittedly, is creepy, and is likely burned into a lot of our psyches from being exposed to it so much at such a young age. Interestingly, the Jeff the Killer character and the creepypasta associated with it came out at different times and were created by completely separate people. The actual character of Jeff the Killer was created by somebody with the alias Susur, and this person exclusively created the aesthetic and the actual character known as Jeff the Killer. However, the creepypasta associated with this character was published by an online user named Game Fuel TV and appeared online roughly around 2011, which is probably the same year that I was exposed to it as well. It's pretty cool that somebody could just create an image, toss it online, and somebody else could write an entire backstory and then have the entire ensemble just explode in popularity. But that was something I learned doing research for this that I thought was interesting. I'm not going to read all of the creepypastas I'm mentioning in this video, but I will be giving brief summaries for each of their stories in case you're either unfamiliar or just need a refresher on the actual lore of the creepypasta. The entire Jeff the Killer story centers around a teenage boy named Jeff, a boy that was only roughly 11 or 12 years old, and he and his family moved to a brand new town where his life essentially got flipped upside down. Not like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air though. The creepypasta itself goes into multiple action sequences about 12-year-old boys getting into knife fights and pouring bleach on each other and setting each other on fire. But to summarize that story as simply as possible, Jeff stabs somebody out of self-defense and his brother takes the blame for it, so Jeff is still free. And then the friends of the people that Jeff stabbed come back for retaliation at this kid's birthday party, and then Jeff stabs the two other kids, and then the first kid that he stabbed that still lived covers Jeff in bleach and alcohol and then sets him on fire. But this doesn't kill Jeff. He actually wakes up in the hospital and he is completely disformed. His skin is bleached white, his hair is singed black, and his eyes are deep into his skull. And when he wakes up in the hospital surrounded by family, all of his friends and family are terrified by his presence, but not him. During the altercation he had where he literally killed two other children, his psyche broke. which was alluded to earlier in the story because, you know, earlier in the creepypasta, there was literally just random points where the author said, Jeff had a feeling, and then it would move on. Regardless, after killing multiple children in kind of self-defense, and then being set on fire and nearly killed, his psyche breaks, and because of this, when he sees his new appearance in the reflection, he loves it, and he is happy to be this monster. After leaving the hospital and going home, being all now deformed and crazy, he takes a knife in the bathroom alone, cuts off his eyelids, and cuts smile scars into his cheeks, which once he completes doing this, his mom walks in on him in the bathroom, acts calm, runs to get Jeff's dad, they both come back, Jeff kills them both, and then Jeff kills his brother, and that's kind of the end of the story. One of the most iconic lines out of the entire creepypasta and Jeff the Killer's kind of slogan is, "Go to sleep," which is what he said to his brother right before he killed him at the end of the creepypasta. At the time of listening to this story in my friend's pillow fort, there was literally nothing more terrifying I could imagine. And I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that this genuinely messed me up for a few days, and I'm sure at least a few of you can relate to that. Although, if you haven't given this a full read through recently or ever, give it a read. Or literally listen to the Creepcast episode where they read the story, because their commentary on just how poorly written this story is actually hilarious.
He had a feeling that was a feeling. It wasn't a painful feeling, but it was a weird feeling.
But yeah, Jeff the Killer started as somebody's artistic project on DeviantArt back in 2008. But a few years later, when somebody decided to add their own backstory to this image, it not only gained traction, but it created an internet icon, and subsequently changed online horror and creepypastas forever. I'm sure there is people that recognize this picture that don't even know what a creepypasta is. And if that's you watching this video, then hey, what's up? But we've still got a lot more to discuss. The next creepypasta I want to discuss is one that's almost, if not as iconic as Jeff the Killer, and it's known as the Russian sleep experiment. The Russian sleep experiment is interesting because not only was the story extremely popular and shared widely online over the last decade, but this creepypasta is unique because it is likely the most believed creepypasta of all time. And to this day, I have people in my comments requesting that I talk about the Russian sleep experiment in my human experiments videos as if it's a real thing. Which, if this is news to you, I apologize to admit that the Russian sleep experiment is not real. Although the compelling storytelling and sort of pseudo-historical aspect of it is really kind of believable. The Russian sleep experiment, similar to Jeff the Killer, also has an iconic image associated with it. And it's an image I can only describe as, well, disturbing. It's like a disheveled creature hunched over on a chair, almost looking mummified. Now, if this image is disturbing you to look at, let me just quickly break the facade and show you what this image is actually based on. This is not a real image of anybody. This is actually an image of a Halloween decoration that was slightly edited, which is also hilarious to think that a Halloween decoration fooled likely hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. The origins of the Russian sleep experiment date back to August 10th, 2010, when the story was published to the Creepypasta wiki by a user known as Orange Soda. 15 years later, I'm sure he didn't assume that his story he wrote would still be fooling thousands and thousands of people to this day. Regardless, the compelling story essentially goes as follows. The Creepypasta claims that in 1947, the Soviet government was conducting a test of a new stimulant gas that would prevent the need for sleep in human patients. Obviously, with the stimulant being rather experimental, the Soviet government needed to test it, so they opted to pick 5 political prisoners that they already had in captivity and essentially offer them freedom if they were willing to conduct an experiment. These 5 political prisoners were placed in an airtight chamber that had thick cement walls and multi-inch thick glass portholes to see in and to see out. There was numerous microphones placed on the inside of the chamber so the scientists could hear the subjects, and there was also a PA system inside of the chamber so that the scientists could speak to the subjects if needed. The goal was to test what exactly would happen to these 5 prisoners in this chamber after being exposed to the stimulant gas and no sleep for 30 days. Once the test subjects were placed in the chamber, the door was shut and sealed, and communication from the scientists to the subjects stopped. The chamber slowly began to fill with the perfect ratio of stimulant gas to air to ensure that the subjects were consistently dosed with this chemical without causing an overexposure and chemical toxicity. The story goes on to claim that only a few days into this experiment, people's psyches begin to crumble. And 4 days into this 30-day experiment, these people went from having casual conversations with each other to being very paranoid about each other, talking almost exclusively about traumatic and dark experiences. And then only 6 days into the experiment, basically avoiding each other altogether, being very paranoid and suspicious of each other. Because of this, all of the subjects would whisper into the microphone to the scientists things about the other subjects, almost trying to barter with the scientists, offering information on the other subjects in return for freedom. Shortly after this, one of the subjects began screaming at the top of his lungs, and he screamed until he couldn't scream anymore. And then another subject began to scream until he couldn't scream anymore. It was after the screaming began that one of the non-screaming patients decided to use fecal matter and newspaper to cover up all of the portholes, and then the chamber went quiet. And at this point, the scientists had no input. They couldn't see inside the chamber, they couldn't hear anything inside the chamber, and they weren't even sure if the people inside were alive. The scientists had a rule of not disturbing anything inside the chamber so that they could monitor the actual side effects of being exposed to the stimulant and the stimulant only. Roughly 14 days into the experiment, the scientists broke the rule and made communications with the subjects inside. But it was at this point when they got an interesting reply. Only one of the subjects calmly replied, telling the scientists that they didn't want to leave the chamber anymore. They didn't want to sleep, and they didn't want to live in a world without this chemical stimulant. The scientists were shocked and didn't know what was going on inside and who was alive. So they made the decision to go inside the chamber and check it out. Soviet soldiers opened the chamber, went inside, and saw likely one of the most disturbing sights they had ever seen. All of the living subjects at this point were disheveled, malnourished, and had picked away at their own skin and flesh. Blood was everywhere, and one of the subjects was literally eaten alive by the others, and his flesh was used to clog one of the drain holes in the floor, likely to keep a higher concentration of the gas in the chamber. One of these subjects was taken in for testing, and it was in the hospital room when he was able to break free until he was once again sedated, finally slept after 15 days, and died. The story itself is really crazy, and honestly, like, I gave this story a bit more detail than I'm gonna give the other sections, simply because the story is actually really good, and it's just so iconic. And if you had the time, I would definitely recommend re-listening to the story itself, and even reading it, depending on your preference. But yeah, the Russian sleep experiment is not real, but it is a great and iconic creepypasta. This next creepypasta opens up an entirely new niche of creepypasta, that being creepypastas based on video games. And I figured what better place to start than Sonic.exe. Growing up, I played a couple random Sonic games on the GameCube, but I wasn't really too deep into the lore. Although when I was first exposed to the story, it still had a rather profound effect on how I saw the entire franchise. Sonic.exe was interesting because for me, and for probably many people, it was the first creepypasta that they experienced based on a character that they already knew and had somewhat of a understanding of and potentially relationship with. Which is why I think for a lot of people, this creepypasta was impactful. The imagery associated with this creepypasta is, unsurprisingly, a depiction of Sonic, although a more devious looking Sonic, specifically with deep black eyes, small red pupils, and seemingly blood dripping out of his eye sockets. Oh, and of course, an evil grin. You can't forget the evil grin. The creepypasta series itself was created by Jack Cranley, and since then has been remixed and retold and continued by others who are inspired by the original creepypasta series and wanted to make this character their own, which is somewhat common across all creepypasta characters. For example, Jeff the Killer appears in a ton of other creepypasta stories just kind of randomly, as if it was a cameo of sorts. But that's part of the fun of telling these stories. The Sonic.exe creepypasta definitely wasn't believable, but it was still somewhat based in reality, which for me, as a kid reading it, definitely drew me right into the storyline. The creepypasta goes as follows. A person receives a mysterious unmarked disc that contains a bootleg version of a Sonic game. They decide to play this game and realize that it's not an ordinary Sonic game, and it's not even a regular bootleg either. The character itself looks demonic, and the gameplay is also twisted. In this bootleg version of the game, Sonic stalks, torments, kills, and tortures all of his friends, colleagues, and enemies in different gruesome ways. The bright and cheerful world of Green Hill Zone was no longer and was now blood-soaked, dark, cloudy, off-putting, and cryptic messages were common across the entirety of the game, with the most memorable being, "I am God." As you would progress within the game, it would seemingly become more and more corrupt. Random flashing lights, random noises, random images, and the Sonic character that you played at slowly becoming sentient and breaking the fourth wall. This then leads to the actual player who got this mysterious disc to experience hallucinations and then receive an even more cryptic message from the entity that actually created the game. And I'll just leave it at that, as to not get too deep into the weeds on the entire story. Sonic.exe is much like Jeff the Killer in the sense that it really kicked off an entire genre. In this case, the genre of haunted video games, and taking iconic, happy, cheerful childhood characters and making them twisted and making an entirely new reality based off of that. The concept is definitely enticing because the world already exists, and your job as an author is to simply make it as dark as possible. It's also pretty similar to Jeff the Killer in the fact that it's just poorly written. Like, if you really want a good laugh, go back and read the actual story. But it almost doesn't even matter how poorly written the original story was, because it was still enough to spark a movement. So sure, it may have not been a literary masterpiece, it was definitely culturally significant when it comes to online horror. But getting off the topic of video games and staying in the realm of cursed media, I want to talk about a creepypasta that deeply, deeply disturbed me as a kid. This creepypasta was based on a TV show that I watched a lot as a kid, and you likely did too. And the story was known as Squidward's Suicide. If you watched SpongeBob growing up like me, you know that Squidward is always the grumpy, kind of unhappy guy. But in this creepypasta, it claims that there is a lost episode of SpongeBob where Squidward isn't just his regular grumpy self. He actually reaches his breaking point and essentially ends it all. This creepypasta was posted on August 8th, 2010, and was written by a user named Suicide Squidward, which is interesting. The story claims that in 2005, an intern at Nickelodeon Studios had stumbled upon a lost episode of SpongeBob. The intern decided to see what this episode was all about. The episode starts normally, although the title card is an interesting piece of foreshadowing, where it explicitly states that the episode's title is Squidward's Suicide, but then goes back to the regular happy music and everything you would associate to be in a SpongeBob episode. The episode starts with Squidward practicing the clarinet for an upcoming concert, but when the concert comes, nobody likes it, and everybody hates it and boos at Squidward. And because of this, it quickly cuts to Squidward being extremely upset, sitting on the side of his bed, essentially contemplating his life. And it's at this time when all you can hear is a disturbing cry that turns into a deafening sob that goes on for minutes and minutes. And on screen, you can only see the camera zoom more and more in Squidward's face. But then quickly, images begin to flash over top of what was already on screen. Only visible for frames at a time, there was brutal images of mangled, dead children simply interjected into this episode of SpongeBob. But there wasn't just one image. There was multiple images of people that were dead, dismembered, and these were real graphic images superimposed onto the children's cartoon. The creepypasta basically just ends with nobody knowing who made this episode or where it came from or who the images of these victims were that were imposed onto this episode, which was kind of part of the disturbing lore because these were pictures of real dead people, but nobody knew if these victims had justice served to whoever did this to them or not, and it was just kind of all really gross and disgusting. And this was one of the ones that rereading it now, I guess with the Russian sleep experiment, really just kind of got me. Not necessarily in a literary sense, but I definitely have a very vivid imagination, and the way that this is written is you really can't not see what they're describing. I've kind of recommended reading the other ones. I would recommend skipping this one and just understanding that this one is just dark. Oh, and I didn't even mention it yet, but the image that's like most associated with this is an image you'd likely have seen before. Just an image of Squidward in a dark room standing in front of a window. His skin is a pale gray and his eyes are extremely dark. Red pupils, once again, dripping blood. And coupled with all of this, Squidward is wearing his signature frown. But while we're still talking about creepypastas based on essentially cursed content, let's finish the trilogy and jump back to another video game-focused creepypasta. And this one isn't necessarily as culturally significant as the other two, but still, at least for me, had a big impact and I think overall is an interesting story. It's known as Pokemon Strangled Red. And it's almost a combination of the last two creepypastas I just discussed. This creepypasta was first seen on September 6th, 2011 on the Creepypasta fandom website, and it was written by user Shadow Male Renamon. There's a bootleg version of a Pokemon game titled Strangled Red. A person begins to play it, and it starts to seem normal, but a little bit uncanny, and then consistently gets darker and darker. You play as a trainer named Steven. Steven was upset about a Pokemon of his that died. It was a Charizard named Mickey. And this undertone really gives a grim outlook on the game, and then with all of the eerie music, glitchy visuals, and dark dialogue, the game only gets more and more disturbing, until you're literally faced with violent scenes and, well, Steven's descent into madness and his own demise. The story itself is decently well written and interesting for sure, and although it wasn't as culturally significant as the others we've suggested, I figured it was still worthy of a spot on this list, and I wanted to at least mention it. It definitely scared me as a kid, and I'm sure it scared at least a few of you as well. But let's keep going. Let's take a break from the twisted content for just a second and get into the real world and talk about some real things. That, of course, being the Goat Man. And if you've watched my videos on cryptids and urban legends, then you would have heard me talk about the Goatman and the Pope Lake Monster a while back. And this ties directly into that, and it's kind of multifaceted, because the Goatman creepypasta most famously associated with the Goatman's demonic bridge, which there's a ton of videos about this bridge. But this video is not about that. This video is about a creepypasta associated with the Goatman urban legend, which is kind of meta. A creepypasta based on an urban legend, based on absolute fact, I'm sure. The specific creepypasta I'm mentioning associated with the Goatman is known as Anasi's Goatman Story, and was originally posted on 4chan, of all places, on September 28th, 2012. This creepypasta admittedly is not one that I actually stumbled upon when I was younger, but when doing research for this video, it was overwhelming how many people felt nostalgic about the story, specifically because a lot of the videos of people reading the story on YouTube today still have comments about people who come back to it often because they just find the story so good. And while it's not the best written story ever, it is definitely unique, which is a trait that's not common when it comes to creepypastas, because most creepypastas typically find themselves either following similar formats or simply using the same tropes over and over again, making creepypastas repetitive and in a lot of cases just cringe and unreadable. That being said, the creepypasta associated with the Goatman is pretty unique, specifically because it doesn't rely on gruesome gore or jump scares or anything extremely morbid. What it does do is lean into more psychological horror with a very slow build-up and a rather interesting payoff. The creepypasta goes as follows. A group of teenagers go on a camping trip for the weekend. They head into some woods near a Native American reservation, and initially they are enjoying the time in the woods. They're playing sports, they're playing games, they're enjoying themselves. But as the day goes on, they've noticed small, interesting things. A foul smell that's been in the air on and off. And now, more recently, later in the day, strange noises appearing in the bushes. Nothing too concerning though, until you and your friends decide to build a fire and relax. When your group notices that there's more people at the campfire than there should be, but nobody knows who has joined them or why. Somebody sitting at the campfire is an imposter, but it is impossible to tell who. And this is where the slow build happens. There is tension and paranoia building within the group because there is more people than they should be. And at this point, they don't know who is who. And everybody is beginning to turn on each other when the group comes to the conclusion that there is a shapeshifter in the group. There's obviously more to the story, but I think that encapsulates the most important part of the story. The aspect of the psychological element of this horror story. It's not necessarily about the gruesome deaths that happen or the disturbing imagery. It's that you are going out with your friends and having fun until somebody else joins your group that nobody noticed, and now nobody can tell who's supposed to be here and who's not. And then the slow game about who is this and how can we tell? And basically just imagine playing Among Us with your friends, but in real life, and your actual life is on the line. And I'm not being vague to be coy. I don't want to spoil it for people who want to go experience the story in full. But trust me, this one's definitely worth a read or a listen. And I wanted to add it to this list because it is typically regarded as one of the most unique and obviously one of the most iconic original creepypastas. I started this video strong, and I knew I had to end this video even stronger. So for the last entry on this list, I have to put probably the most iconic creepypasta character of all time. A character that has not only creepypastas, but games and movies and then some. This is probably the only creepypasta on the list that your mom has a good chance of recognizing due to the mass amount of Halloween costumes in just popular media. And if you haven't guessed it yet, I'm of course talking about the Slenderman. The Slenderman holds such a near and dear place in my heart because it is so iconic, and for some reason was such a big part of my childhood as well too. I remember watching all of my favorite YouTubers play the game. I remember reading the creepypasta with my friends in school and getting scared. And I remember even trying to download the game online and getting a virus on my family computer when trying to be a YouTuber when I was like 10. And don't even get me started about how my pants began to fall off as I was downloading this game, and it was just crazy. There was a virus, but that's a whole different story. The iconic aesthetic and look of this Slenderman character dates back to 2009, when there was a Photoshop contest on the Something Awful forums. This contest was the catalyst for the Slenderman character, and from that point on, it was game over. The person who originally created the character was named Eric Knudsen, and his simple depiction of a tall, humanoid, yet featureless figure wearing a black suit was simple and vague and uncanny enough to spark so many different fan stories and fan fiction, but we're not going to talk about that. The original Slenderman creepypasta story was released on January 14th, 2010, which I just want to say 2010 was such a good year for creepypasta, and possibly the peak and golden era of creepypastas as a whole. Regardless, there is now so much media associated with the Slenderman character. I just kind of want to talk about the character as a whole, because at this point I could talk about different stories for days. The general vibe and consistent theme across all media associated with the Slenderman is just the following, is that he is almost exclusively around children, typically stalking them, slaughtering them, and potentially doing other things as well, which aren't even known. Slenderman is most commonly photographed with large groups of children, which is actually where the origin photos come from. During this Photoshop contest, the photoshopping was actually just a group of children with this uncanny figure superimposed in the background, as we showed previously. In some articles, it's claimed that Slenderman even mentally influences these children and drives them into madness, and in others it's claimed that he simply abducts them and they are never seen again. Regardless, the Slenderman has an affinity for children, which alone is already creepy enough, coupled with his simple yet terrifying look. Part of the charm is the Slenderman is kind of the fact that less is more. Literally nothing is known about this character. There's no motives, he's never spoken, there's really no origin story. He typically was seen in pictures, not videos, meaning it's not even certain how he moves, unless you've obviously seen it in videos or played the game, but it's just ominous. A featureless, emotionless, potentially thoughtless figure, resembling a human, yet missing anything that would meaningfully make it a human. It's kind of genius. And combine that with, vulnerable children just being in the mix, and you have a, well, scary story. The Slenderman has been known to abduct children either in suburban areas, but most typically in the woods, lurking behind trees and shadows. And I'll be honest, out of all of the creepypastas that I've mentioned and experienced when I was younger, even as an adult, this was one of the ones that definitely had me turning off the lights and running up the stairs as fast as possible. Because, well, if the basement was dark and I was leaving it, there was a possibility that Slenderman could be there and wanting to abduct me. These are some of my favorite creepypastas that I remember from my childhood, and hopefully for you, this was entertaining and potentially even nostalgic as well.